You think you know the Wizard of Oz? A girl named Dorothy from a Kansas farm whirled away by a tornado into a fantastical land. A pair of sparkling shoes, a trail of yellow bricks, a talking scarecrow, a tin man who squeaks for want of oil, a lion who shakes in fear, and a city of emerald green ruled by an all-powerful wizard. For generations, this story has been told as a delightful children's fantasy about friendship and the power of believing. We picture Judy Garland clutching her dog and singing about somewhere over the rainbow. We dress up our children as munchkins for school plays. We quote lines about lions and tigers and bears. We imagine the witch melting and cheer. We never ask why the road is yellow. We never question why the shoes are silver in the book and ruby in the film. We never stop to think what was happening in the world when L Frank Baum wrote his story or when MGM turned it into a movie. We never see the real horror hiding in plain sight. Because once you understand the history that shaped this tale, once you see who Dorothy really represents and what the Emerald City really is, the world of Oz transforms before your eyes. It is no longer a harmless dreamland, but a political battleground. It is a map of economic despair disguised as a fairy tale. The scarecrow, the tin woodman, and the cowardly lion are not just whimsical companions. They are human beings broken by a system that values profit over people. The yellow brick road is not a convenient path. It is a gilded trap. The wizard is not merely a fraud. He is a stand-in for an entire class of politicians who promised salvation and delivered nothing. And the most chilling truth is that the horror in Oz was not fantasy. It was real. It was happening outside the pages of Baum's book and beyond the sound stages of Hollywood. Families were starving. Children were being sent into mines. Workers were dying on factory floors. Teenage actresses were being drugged and abused on film sets. To understand the hidden horror of The Wizard of Oz is to journey back to a time of economic collapse and exploitation, and to see how a children's story became a code for survival. When L. Frank Baum published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900, the United States was just emerging from a devastating depression. The Panic of 1893 had shaken the nation to its core. Banks failed. Railroads went bankrupt. Factories closed. In the Midwestern and Western states, the collapse of the economy was catastrophic. Gold reserves in the Treasury fell sharply as people hoarded coins. Panic spread from town to town. Depositors lined up outside banks to demand their money. As historians at the Federal Reserve have shown, the crisis erupted because the government's gold reserves dwindled and economic activity slowed. Depositors, fearing that paper money would become worthless, rushed to convert their holdings into gold coins. 100 banks suspended operations in June of 1893. By August, 340 banks had closed. Industrial production plunged by 15%, and unemployment surged to nearly 1/5 of the working population. Towns across the Midwest were littered with empty storefronts and hungry families. Farmers, already burdened by falling crop prices and mounting debts, found themselves unable to pay their mortgages. Railroad agents and bank officers showed no mercy. They foreclosed on farms and evicted families by the thousands. In these circumstances, it felt like the ground itself was giving way. It is no coincidence that Baum begins his book with the earth torn open by a cyclone. The Depression did more than ruin bank accounts. It exposed deep fault lines in American society. The country was still tethered to the gold standard, meaning that every paper dollar could be exchanged for a fixed quantity of gold. This system protected creditors and bankers because it kept the value of money high. But it strangled farmers and working people by limiting the supply of currency. With not enough money in circulation, prices fell. Farmers received less for their crops, but still owed the same amount on their loans. Desperate for relief, a coalition of farmers, labourers, and activists from the South and Midwest formed what became known as the Populist Party or People's Party. These populists demanded that the government abandon the strict gold standard and adopt bimetallism, the coining of both gold and silver. They believed that introducing silver coins would expand the money supply, create mild inflation, and make it easier for debtors to pay their loans. They also called for the nationalization of railroads, a graduated income tax, the direct election of senators, and government ownership of telegraph systems. They railed against the power of railroads and banks. They warned that the country was being crucified on a cross of gold. Their leader, William Jennings Bryan, electrified the Democratic National Convention in 1896 with his famous speech in which he declared that no American should be crucified on a cross of gold. The populist platform galvanized thousands of struggling farmers and workers who felt betrayed by both major parties. Baum, a former newspaper editor who had once written editorials criticizing bankers and expressing sympathy for farmers, witnessed this turmoil firsthand. He lived in the Dakota Territory for several years, watching prairie towns boom and bust. He saw what a poor harvest could do to a family. He heard the new populist rhetoric on street corners and read it in newspapers. He may not have been a radical activist, but he absorbed the language of bimetallism and understood the pain of those around him. It was in this atmosphere that he created Dorothy and Her Companions. In 1964, historian Henry Littlefield published an article arguing that The Wizard of Oz was a parable on populism. Littlefield suggested that Baum hid his social commentary behind a children's story to reach a broad audience without facing censorship. Subsequent scholars expanded and refined Littlefield's analysis, drawing parallels between characters in the book and people and issues from the 1890s. These interpretations are not universally accepted, but they provide a striking lens through which to view Baum's creation. Let us walk that yellow brick road with newly opened eyes and see what each character and symbol might have meant to readers living through economic collapse. Imagine you are an exhausted Midwestern farmer in 1899, reading the serial publication of Baum's story in a children's magazine. You have spent years watching railroads and banks squeeze your profits. Your house creaks and shudders every time the wind howls across the plains. You read that Dorothy lives in a dreary Kansas farmhouse where everything is grey. You recognize that palette. You know the sky when dust turns midday into twilight and your world becomes monotone. The cyclone that tears Dorothy from her home is not just a plot device. It is the economic whirlwind that has swept away thousands of families. When Dorothy's house lands in a strange land and crushes the Wicked Witch of the East, you may feel a surge of hope. The Witch of the East represents the banks and industrial barons of the eastern states. In the allegory, her death at the hands of an ordinary farmer's daughter symbolizes the populist hope that the common people could overthrow Eastern financial dominance. The silver shoes that Dorothy inherits from the dead witch were originally silver slippers in Baum's book. Silver shoes walking on a yellow brick road, silver and gold conjure the bimetallism debate. Dorothy does not realize the power of her shoes until the end of her journey, reflecting how many Americans did not understand the intricacies of monetary policy. In MGM's 1939 film, the shoes were changed to ruby to take advantage of Technicolor. The political code was hidden behind red glitter. Dorothy herself is described as an innocent, plucky, good-natured girl. She represents the American people, particularly the plain folk of the Midwest. She is resourceful, but naive. She trusts that the wizard will solve her problems, just as many citizens placed their faith in political leaders to deliver solutions. Her companion Toto, a little dog, is sometimes interpreted as a nod to the Prohibition Party, a small fringe group pulling at the heels of mainstream movements. In some readings, the name Toto echoes the teetotalers who opposed alcohol. In others, he symbolizes the idea that small, marginalized groups can expose fraud. Remember, it is Toto who pulls back the curtain to reveal that the wizard is just an ordinary man. As Dorothy sets out on her journey, she follows the yellow brick road. In the economic allegory, this road represents the gold standard. It gleams with promise, but it leads to a place that does not deliver on its glittering appearance. The road seems smooth at first, but becomes broken and dangerous in the forest. The Munchkins who send Dorothy on her way can be viewed as the Eastern industrial workers, subject to the power of the Wicked Witch of the East. They celebrate the witch's death, hoping that they are now free. They tell Dorothy to follow the road because they believe the wizard will help. They trust authority because they have no other options. The first companion Dorothy meets is the Scarecrow. He is found stuck on a pole in a field, unable to move, claiming that he has no brains. Littlefield and later scholars interpreted the Scarecrow as the American farmer. For decades, newspapers and politicians had mocked farmers as ignorant hayseeds who did not understand modern economics. Farmers were criticized for their populist ideas and described as fools chasing conspiracy theories. In Baum's story, the Scarecrow believes he is stupid because he has been told so. He sings a song about how he would think of things he never thunk before if he only had a brain. Yet throughout the story, he proves to be clever and resourceful. He devises strategies to cross chasms and rescues his companions from danger. His self-doubt echoes the inferiority imposed on farmers by city folks, but his actions show that the so-called ignorant farmer has more common sense than his critics. At one point, the Scarecrow falls on the hard yellow bricks and is not harmed. Populists blamed the gold standard for their woes, but the Scarecrow's resilience suggests that gold alone was not the sole culprit. The road is hard, but the farmer can endure it. Next, Dorothy meets the Tin Woodman, whose story is one of the most haunting in the book. Once a healthy, flesh-and-blood lumberjack, he fell in love with a Munchkin girl. But the Wicked Witch of the East hated his happiness and enchanted his axe, so that each time he swung it, it cut off one of his limbs. The local tinsmith replaced his missing body parts with tin. Eventually, he lost his heart and all his human flesh. He became a machine who cannot feel. The Tin Woodman symbolizes the American industrial worker, particularly those in the East, whom the populists hoped to recruit. In the real world of the 1890s, factories were rapidly mechanizing. Workers were dehumanized, treated as cogs in a machine. They lost their jobs and their identities to technology and corporate greed. When the Depression hit, many factory workers were laid off and rusted like the Tin Woodman. In Baum's tale, the Tin Woodman is literally immobilized by rust when Dorothy finds him. He stands in the forest, silent and forgotten, until she oils his joints. With a little care and compassion, he comes back to life. Populist leaders argued that with government assistance such as public works programs or bimetallism to stimulate the economy, idle workers could be put back to work. The Tin Woodman's desire for a heart reflects the longing of workers to be treated as human beings, not machines. The tale warns that industrialization can strip people of their humanity unless society takes action to restore it. The last companion to join Dorothy is the cowardly lion. This roaring creature claims he has no courage. He trembles at the smallest danger and speaks of his shame. Yet when his friends are in trouble, he leaps into battle. Scholars have identified the lion with William Jennings Bryan, the charismatic orator known for his booming voice. Bryan was called the Lion of Nebraska and was famous for his cross of gold speech advocating free silver. His critics accused him of being a coward for opposing the Spanish-American War and the annexation of the Philippines, while his supporters praised his anti-imperialist stance. In the story, the lion joins the group late, just as Bryan entered the populist movement relatively late compared to farmer leaders. He hopes the wizard will give him courage, but like the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman, he discovers he had courage all along. The idea that the political leaders of the populist movement already possessed the qualities they sought from Washington resonates with the movement's self-sufficiency. They did not need permission from the establishment to fight for their rights. Together, Dorothy and her friends follow the yellow brick road toward the Emerald City. Along the way, they encounter obstacles that mirror the real difficulties facing Americans during the Depression. They enter a forest where the road is in disrepair. They fall asleep in a field of poppies whose scent induces a deadly slumber. The poppy field can be read as a reference to the opium trade and the narcotic haze that allowed some to escape their misery. In the 1890s, opium derivatives like laudanum were common medicines used by all social classes. Addictive substances offered a temporary reprieve from hunger and despair. In the story, it is Dorothy and the lion who fall victim to the poppies, the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman, who lack lungs and hearts, are immune. It is the field mice, representing common people, who rescue them. The mice later pledge their obedience to the Tin Woodman for killing a wildcat, another symbol of predatory capitalism. The travelers also face monsters that stand in for trusts and monopolies. Baum writes of a giant spider that terrorizes the animals of the forest. The lion kills the beast by knocking off its head. Populists often described railroad companies and banks as octopuses or spiders that ensnared the nation. By slaying the beast, the lion symbolically destroys the monopolies. The animals pledge loyalty to him, just as populists hoped workers and farmers would rally behind Bryan to defeat the trusts. One of the most striking episodes involves the winged monkeys. These creatures are not wicked by nature, but have been enslaved by a golden cap. Whoever wears the cap can command them 3 times. The Witch of the West uses the cap to force the monkeys to attack Dorothy's group. In the allegory, The winged monkeys represent the indigenous peoples of the plains. They once lived freely, flying from tree to tree, eating nuts and fruit, doing as they pleased. Then Oz, representing the federal government, came from the clouds and sequestered them. They were forced onto reservations and later compelled to work for the witch. Reformers of the time argued that Native Americans had been corrupted by white policies and that their condition was not inherent but imposed. In Baum's story, the monkeys are redeemed when Dorothy, representing benevolent populists, frees them by using the cap and then giving it to Glinda. This reflects the belief that assimilation and fair treatment could restore indigenous peoples to their rightful freedom. The journey also takes Dorothy and her companions into dainty China country, a walled land where everything and everyone is made of china. The floor is white and the walls are high. It is a fragile, beautiful place that can be shattered with a touch. The parallels to China are clear. At the end of the 19th century, China was being carved into spheres of influence by imperial powers. It was the only major nation still on the silver standard, making its economy particularly relevant to the silver debate. The wall and the white floor evoke the Great Wall of China and the color of silver bullion. The group's clumsy presence in the China country, with the lion accidentally knocking over a church, mirrors the destructive intrusion of Western missionaries and merchants in China. Baum's inclusion of this episode hints at anti-imperialist sentiments shared by populists like Brian, who opposed the annexation of the Philippines and foreign adventures. Then there are the Winkies, the yellow people of the West, who are forced to work for the witch. Scholars have suggested that they represent Chinese immigrants and Filipino natives. During the 1890s, Chinese laborers had built railroads and worked in mines, but faced brutal discrimination, low pay, and violent attacks. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 banned most Chinese immigration. Filipinos, after the U.S. annexation of their country in 1898, found themselves under a new colonial master. In Baum's stage adaptation of Oz, the Scarecrow jokes that people rarely know anything about their own country, pointing to the arrogance of imperialists who claimed to know better than indigenous people. When Dorothy melts the Wicked Witch of the West, she frees the Winkies. Their liberation suggests a hope for racial justice and an end to exploitation. At last, the travelers reach the Emerald City. To enter, they must don green spectacles that make everything appear emerald. The city is dazzling, but the color is an illusion. Greenbacks, paper money, were a point of contention in the 1890s. The Emerald City, with its fake shine, can represent Washington, D.C. Politicians promised prosperity, but delivered illusion. When Dorothy and her friends meet the wizard, he appears differently to each of them: a giant head, a lovely lady, a ball of fire, a fearsome beast. He demands that they kill the Wicked Witch before he will grant their wishes. When they return, he tries to delay them again. Finally, Toto pulls aside a curtain to reveal that the wizard is just a man from Omaha who made a living as a circus performer and balloonist. He admits that he is a humbug. He has no real power. He merely manipulates appearances. Scholars have connected the wizard to politicians such as William McKinley or his advisor Mark Hanna, or even to the broader class of Gilded Age presidents who promised reforms but were controlled by business interests. Baum emphasizes that the wizard can take on any form he wishes, reflecting how politicians shape their image for different audiences. He refuses to grant favors without something in return. He represents the transactional nature of politics. Dorothy and her companions discover that the things they sought from the wizard are already within them. The Scarecrow had a brain. The Tin Woodman had compassion. The lion had courage. They did not need the wizard's magic. This can be read as a commentary on the populist movement. Ordinary people possessed the intelligence, solidarity, and bravery to change their circumstances without waiting for a savior. Yet the story's conclusion is ambivalent. In the book, after the wizard departs in his hot air balloon, the Scarecrow becomes the ruler of the Emerald City, the Tin Woodman takes charge of the Winkies, and the lion becomes king of the forest. Dorothy uses her silver shoes to return to Kansas by clicking her heels 3 times. Some scholars have suggested that this ending hints at the failure of the populist cause. Populists gained regional power, but never captured the presidency. Bryan lost his bid for the White House. The movement faded after the election of 1896, and the gold standard remained until the 1930s. Dorothy's return to Kansas may signify the country's reversion to the status quo. In recounting this journey, it is easy to forget that the story itself was not a static artifact. It evolved as it moved from page to stage to screen. Baum's original book contained details that were later sanitized or removed. For example, the silver shoes were turned into ruby slippers in the film for the sake of color technology. The film also omitted the Queen of the Field mice and the giant spider. It downplayed the winged monkey's backstory and removed the anti-imperialist jokes. By the time audiences saw Judy Garland skip down the yellow brick road in 1939, much of the political context had been scrubbed away. The film emphasized individual wish fulfillment over collective action. It replaced cautionary allegory with songs and spectacle. Yet even the film production carries its own dark history of exploitation. The making of The Wizard of Oz was a catalogue of negligence and abuse. MGM cast 16-year-old Judy Garland as Dorothy. She was already a veteran of vaudeville, having performed since she was a toddler. To prepare her for the role, studio executives forced her to wear a tight corset to flatten her chest and maintain an image of innocence. They controlled her diet, allowing her little more than coffee, cigarettes, and chicken soup. To keep her energy up during long days of filming, they administered stimulant pills. When they needed her to sleep, they gave her barbiturates. Judy developed a dependence on these drugs that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her ex-husband, Sid Luft, later alleged that adult male actors playing munchkins groped her on set, putting their hands under her dress. She laughed it off in interviews decades later, but the trauma remained. The makeup and costumes on the film were not just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. Buddy Ebsen, the original Tin Man, nearly died because his makeup contained aluminum dust. The metallic powder coated his lungs, causing cramps and shortness of breath. He was hospitalized and replaced by Jack Haley. Even after the makeup was changed to a paste, Haley developed an eye infection. Margaret Hamilton, the actress who played the Wicked Witch of the West, suffered severe burns during a scene in which she exits Munchkinland in a puff of flame. A trapdoor malfunctioned, and flames engulfed her face and hand. She spent weeks in the hospital recovering. When she returned, she refused to do any more fire scenes. Her stunt double later suffered burns while flying on a broomstick that emitted sparks. In the scene where Dorothy and her friends fall asleep in the poppy field, the snow was made from asbestos fibers. The production used clouds of the toxic mineral to create a snowy effect, coating the actors in carcinogenic dust. At the time, no one knew the health risks, but the choice reveals how little care was taken for the cast's well-being. Other actors also faced harm. The Cowardly Lion's costume weighed nearly 100 pounds, made of real lion skin and fur. Actor Bert Lahr sweated profusely under the lights, dehydrated and exhausted. The painted green makeup used on the Wicked Witch contained copper, which could have been toxic if ingested. The actors playing Munchkins were underpaid and mistreated. Many were little people from various backgrounds who were promised fair wages but received a fraction of what taller actors earned. Some were so poor that they lived in shared housing and were bused to set. Jack Haley recalled that some of the actors were heavy drinkers, which producers used to paint them as unruly, further justifying their mistreatment. The choreographer of the Lollipop Guild rehearsed them for long hours without adequate breaks. The exploitation extended beyond physical harm. MGM's control over Judy Garland's image and life was absolute. Louis B. Mayer, the studio head, called her "my little hunchback," ridiculing her appearance to keep her self-esteem low. Garland later said that being placed on drugs and having her weight monitored from childhood warped her relationship with food and her body. By the time she finished filming The Wizard of Oz, she was addicted to amphetamines and barbiturates. Her dependencies contributed to health problems that culminated in an accidental overdose in 1969 at age 47. The film that launched her into stardom also set her on a path of suffering. The tragedies on set were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a broader system that exploited workers in the pursuit of profit. Hollywood in the 1930s operated under a studio system that treated actors and crew as property. Contracts were ironclad. Actors had no control over their roles or schedules. Safety regulations were minimal. Long shoots, intense heat from arc lights, and lack of ventilation were common. In many ways, the film industry mirrored the exploitative conditions of the mines, factories, and railroads that the populists decried 40 years earlier. The yellow brick road might have been fiction, but the misery along the way was not. Even outside the film, the themes of exploitation that underpin The Wizard of Oz can be traced to countless real children whose lives mirrored those of Dorothy's companions. Consider the child laborers of the late 19th century. In coal mines across Pennsylvania and West Virginia, breaker boys as young as 8 sat on wooden benches for 10 hours a day, picking slate and rock from coal as it rushed down chutes. Their fingers bled. The dust blackened their lungs. In the sulfur mines of Sicily, Carusi boys as young as 5 were chained to carts and forced to haul loads of ore weighing 25 to 80 kilograms. They worked in darkness for 8 to 10 hours. Their bodies became hunched and stunted. Their growth was permanently arrested. They slept in the mines and were beaten if they slowed down or tried to escape. Booker T. Washington visited these mines and likened them to hell. He wrote about boys being burned with lanterns and whipped until they bled. Sir Thomas Oliver, a British doctor, observed that adult miners who had started as Carusi were barely 4 feet tall, with deformed chests and childish minds. Laws to protect these children existed on paper but were ignored. On the streets of American and European cities, little boys played instruments for coins, enslaved by padroni who had leased or kidnapped them from poor families. They were forced to perform for 15 hours a day, handing over every cent. If they did not bring back enough money, they were beaten and starved. Many died from exhaustion or cold. In factories, children labored 13 to 15 hours a day, crawling under moving looms to retrieve broken threads, losing fingers and hands to whirring machinery. They earned a fraction of an adult wage, but their families depended on that meager income to survive. Reformers took photographs of these children, their faces smudged with soot, to shock the public and spur legislation. The populist call for government intervention in railroads and industry was not just about monetary policy. It was a demand to stop the human cost of unchecked capitalism. When Baum wrote about the Tin Woodman losing his limbs to a cursed axe, readers in mining towns and mill villages would have thought of boys losing fingers and arms to machines. When he described the scarecrow being mocked for his lack of brains, farmers might have remembered newspaper editorials calling them ignorant and lazy. When he wrote about the cowardly lion's fear of battle, people who opposed imperial wars would have recognized their own politics. When Dorothy melted the wicked witch with a bucket of water, those who dreamed of sweeping away corruption might have imagined the water as a flood of democratic energy washing away entrenched power. The story spoke to the despair and hope of its time. By the time MGM released the film adaptation in 1939, the United States had just begun to climb out of another economic abyss, the Great Depression of the 1930s. Mass unemployment, bread lines, and failed banks were recent memories. The New Deal had introduced government programs to put people back to work, much like the populists' proposed public works. The Dust Bowl had ravaged farms across the plains, forcing families to migrate just as Dorothy is forced to leave home. The film offered an escape from this grim reality, but also quietly referenced it. The sepia-toned opening scenes in Kansas look like scenes from Depression-era newsreels. Dorothy longs to escape to a place where dreams come true, as millions long to escape poverty. The line "there's no place like home" resonates differently when home has been foreclosed. And behind the scenes, the actors endured their own hardships, reflecting the exploitation that still plagued workers even as the nation modernized. The hidden horror of The Wizard of Oz is that the fantasy of Oz never fully exists separate from the real world. The story is haunted by economic anxieties and the suffering of real people. It uses whimsy to encode messages about monetary policy, labor rights, and political corruption. It wraps a parable of populism in the technicolor of Hollywood. When the curtain is pulled back, we see not only a humbug wizard, but an entire society built on illusion. The yellow brick road is paved with gold, but leads to a city where the walls are painted green to hide poverty. The silver shoes have the power to return Dorothy home, but she spends the entire story seeking permission to use them. The Scarecrow, Tin Woodman, and Lion already possess what they desire, but they endure hardship because they believe someone else must grant them fulfillment. The Winkies and winged monkeys are freed, but only when someone from outside their communities intervenes. The message is both empowering and cautionary. The means to change are often in our possession, but we have been taught to rely on those who benefit from our ignorance. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson comes from the figure of the wizard. His power lies not in magic, but in theatre. He manipulates people by using machines, smoke, and mirrors. He demands loyalty and labor in exchange for promises he cannot keep. When he is exposed, he begs Dorothy not to reveal his secret. He fears being ruined. He confesses that he has been making a living by pretending. In a time of economic crisis, politicians often made grand promises. They claimed that by adhering to the gold standard, the economy would stabilize. They insisted that free silver would bring prosperity. They vowed to protect workers while courting industrialists. They changed their appearance depending on their audience. Like the wizard, they were terrified of being exposed. The wizard's balloon, which carries him away by accident, is reminiscent of Brian's oratory being called hot air by his detractors. The idea that the leaders are full of hot air is as relevant now as it was then. As we reflect on The Wizard of Oz today, more than a century after its publication and 8 decades after the film's release, we find that its hidden horrors continue to resonate. Our world has seen new populist movements rise and fall. Economic crises have returned, from the recession of 2008 to the upheavals of global pandemics. Workers still face exploitation in factories and warehouses. Child labor persists in parts of the world. Political leaders still use spectacle to conceal substance. We still follow yellow brick roads laid out by those in power, hoping to reach an emerald city that may not exist. We still look for wizards to solve our problems, forgetting that we may already hold the means to change our circumstances. Dorothy's journey reminds us that courage, compassion, and intelligence are not granted by leaders, but discovered within. It warns us that the real monsters may not be witches with green skin, but institutions that devalue human life. It challenges us to notice the people behind the curtain pulling the levers of our world. There is one more layer of horror woven into this tale. When Baum wrote his story, the United States was also grappling with issues of race and empire. In his journalism, Baum infamously published editorials calling for the extermination of Native Americans after the death of Sitting Bull and the massacre at Wounded Knee. His views were shaped by the white settler perspective of the Dakotas. These pieces stand in stark contrast to the empathy he seemed to show in his allegory of the winged monkeys. Some scholars argue that the benevolent treatment of the monkeys in Oz reflects a subconscious guilt over the mistreatment of indigenous peoples. Others see it as an attempt to justify assimilation. The point is that Baum was not a saint. He was a product of his time, capable of creating a story that resonated with oppressed groups while also holding prejudices. Similarly, MGM's film became a beloved classic while participating in the exploitation of its stars. No one involved in The Wizard of Oz was purely good or purely evil. The story's power lies in its complexity and its ability to mirror the contradictions of society. In telling the hidden horror of The Wizard of Oz, we confront the uncomfortable truth that our culture often disguises pain with fantasy. We sing along with cheerful songs while ignoring the suffering of the performers. We teach children stories about courage and kindness without explaining the economic realities that inspired them. We become so enchanted by emerald cities that we forget to look at what they are built on. The Wizard of Oz endures because it speaks to our deepest desires and fears. It promises that there is a place beyond the rainbow where dreams come true. But it also whispers that we might have the power to create that place ourselves. The horror is not that witches and flying monkeys exist. The horror is that real people were forced to live and die in conditions worse than any fiction. The horror is that we might still be living in Oz, dazzled by illusion, while real problems remain unsolved. If Dorothy were here today, what would she see? She might see farms struggling under climate change and corporate consolidation. She might see factories replaced by warehouses where workers package products for e-commerce giants under relentless surveillance. She might see politicians promising to make our lives great again, while behind the scenes they serve donors. She might see teenagers on film sets being pushed beyond exhaustion for streaming content. She might see children mining cobalt in African mines for batteries powering our phones. She might recognize the winged monkeys in migrant workers detained at borders. She might find her silver shoes replaced by promises of quick fixes sold to us by influencers. She might feel the same mixture of hope and despair. And she might still click her heels and whisper, "There is no place like home," because home is not a location. It is a state of justice we have yet to build. In the end, The Wizard of Oz is not just a story about a girl going home. It is a warning about the forces that uproot families and crush communities. It is a call to pay attention to the struggles of farmers, workers, indigenous peoples, immigrants, and children. It is a reminder that magical solutions offered by charismatic leaders are often hollow. It is a testament to the resilience of ordinary people who can find brains, hearts, and courage within themselves. The hidden horror of Oz does not diminish its beauty. It deepens it. The next time you watch Dorothy follow the yellow brick road, listen for the echoes of the past. Hear the voices of populists demanding bimetallism. Hear the cries of Carusi hauling ore. Hear the singing of Italian street boys yearning for freedom. Hear the studio's orders to a teenager to lose weight and take another pill. Hear the warnings about crosses of gold and emerald lies. And remember that behind every fantasy there is a reality waiting to be acknowledged. Perhaps when we face these truths, we can finally make our way home. In order to truly grasp the darkness hidden beneath the gleaming surfaces of The Wizard of Oz, one must look far beyond the handful of allegorical connections that have become well known. It is not enough to say that the scarecrow stands in for farmers or that the Tin Woodman mirrors factory workers. These characters are deeply rooted in specific historical struggles. The scarecrow was born of a time when farmers were trapped between the hammer and the anvil of deflation and debt. Their story did not end with a single election, nor did their suffering vanish when Brian was defeated. To see the horror in Oz, one must visit the farms of the late 19th century, stand in the fields of wheat and corn that waved under a sky pregnant with dust, and listen to the creak of wagons carrying families away from foreclosed homesteads. Prices for wheat and cotton fell year after year. Farm equipment grew more expensive as monopolies controlled production. Railroads charged exorbitant fees to carry crops to market, and grain elevators took their cut at every step. When international competition drove prices even lower, many farmers were forced into sharecropping or tenancy, losing ownership of the very land their fathers had cleared. Bankers in distant cities extended credit when crops were good and called in loans when weather or pests ruined a harvest. It is no wonder that farmers organized into granges and alliances, demanding regulation and relief. It is no wonder that in The Scarecrow, Baum created a gentle soul who believes he is stupid because he has been told so, when in truth he possesses a quiet wisdom gleaned from seasons of toil. In the story, Dorothy helps him down from his pole, just as populist organizers tried to liberate farmers from ridicule. The Tin Woodman deserves equal attention. At first glance, he is a novelty, a man made of metal, rusting stiff in the forest. But his history, as recounted in the book, is harrowing. He once was a flesh and blood man who made his living chopping down trees. A wicked enchantment caused his axe to slip and sever his limbs one by one. Each time, a tinsmith replaced the lost limb with tin. Eventually, even his heart was cut away. This is not simply a fairy tale about magic. It is a representation of what the industrial system did to workers. Railroads, mills, and factories demanded that men become machines. Each accident on the job cost flesh and blood, and each replacement part turned a person into something less human. In 1890 alone, railroads killed over 6,000 workers and injured 30,000 more. There were no safety rails, no standardized couplings. Workers lost fingers, arms, and legs to gears and belts. Employers argued that accidents were the price of progress. Politicians passed liability laws that often shielded companies from responsibility. The Tin Woodman's rust, which immobilizes him when he weeps, is the tear-filled paralysis of men who find themselves useless after an injury. Oil, provided by compassion from friends, frees him. In the allegory, this oil is solidarity and sympathy among workers, something populists and union organizers sought to foster. But like many injured laborers, the Tin Woodman fears that he lacks a heart, that he has lost the capacity to feel. He yearns for emotion in a world that demands he be unfeeling to survive. When the wizard gives him a silk heart stuffed with sawdust, it is a cruel joke on the idea that sentimental gifts can repair systemic harm. Then there is the cowardly lion, whose roar belies an inner sense of inadequacy. William Jennings. Bryan was known as the Great Commoner, a politician whose oratory thundered across the land. His Cross of Gold speech remains one of the most famous in American history. In it, he likened the deflationary policies of the gold standard to a crucifixion. He cried that mankind must not be crucified upon a cross of gold. Those who heard the speech described being electrified. Women wept. Men threw their hats in the air. But Bryan lost 3 presidential elections. His opponents painted him as an extremist. Newspapers portrayed him as shrill, naive, and unfit to lead. The cowardly lion in Baum's story appears fierce, but often cowers. He doubts his own courage until the wizard gives him a medal. Scholars argue that this medal is a commentary on how politicians offer symbols instead of substantive change. Yet Bryan's courage was not lacking. He campaigned tirelessly across the country, traveling more than 18,000 miles by train during one campaign, delivering hundreds of speeches. His platform included not only free silver, but also anti-imperialism, direct election of senators, and stronger antitrust laws. He later became Secretary of State and resigned rather than support a drift toward war in Europe. The allegory is not a direct condemnation of Bryan, but a reflection of how reformers are portrayed as cowardly when they challenge entrenched power. The Witches of Oz demand a deeper look as well. The Wicked Witch of the East is crushed by Dorothy's house at the start of the book. She is described as a tyrant who enslaved the Munchkins and who had only one weakness: water. Some interpretations identify her with the bankers and financiers of the East Coast, who wielded enormous power over farmers and workers. Like the Wicked Witch, they drew strength from monopolies and high interest rates. They wore the golden cap, controlling the winged monkeys, who are forced to serve three different owners in the story. The Witch of the West is more enigmatic. She rules over the Winkies and sends wolves, crows, and bees to kill Dorothy and her companions. She is associated with dryness and drought. In the populist allegory, she is sometimes linked to the railroad monopolies, which controlled access to markets in the western states. Others see her as a representation of the harsh natural conditions of the western plains, cyclones, drought, and dust storms that punished farmers. Water destroys her, perhaps indicating that the solution to economic drought is liquidity in the form of more money. The Good Witch of the North and the Good Witch of the South stand for the supportive regions. The North with its industrial workers, and the South with its farmers and poor white and black citizens who struggled together against plantation elites and merchants. In the book, The Good Witch of the South teaches Dorothy that she always possessed the power to return home by using her silver shoes. This moment suggests that oppressed people, armed with knowledge and unity, have the means to relieve their suffering without reliance on distant wizards. The path Dorothy takes winds through many other symbolic lands. Consider the field of poppies in which she and her companions fall asleep. At first glance, it is a magical trap laid by the witch. On a deeper level, it may represent the opium problem of the 19th century. Opium and its derivatives, including laudanum, were widely used to treat pain, coughs, and various ailments. Doctors prescribed opiates for women's hysteria and for children's teething. Patent medicines often contained morphine or alcohol. Addiction was common, though not fully understood. The poppy field could also reflect another drug: the constant flow of entertainment and alcohol that lulled workers into complacency. Political cartoonists in the 1890s depicted the working class as intoxicated by cheap amusements, while corporate barons pulled the strings. In the story, the poppies put Dorothy to sleep, but the Scarecrow and Tin Woodman, being without flesh, carry her out. This may signify that solidarity among different sectors of society can rescue those sedated by false pleasures. Beyond the poppies lies the dainty China country, a fragile land of porcelain people and buildings. The inhabitants do not want to leave their land for fear of breaking. The travelers must tread carefully. A misstep could shatter an entire person. Scholars connect this episode to the relationship between the United States and China during the open door policy era. In the late 19th century, European powers and Japan carved spheres of influence in China, imposing unequal treaties and demanding access to markets and resources. The United States, seeking its own slice, proposed that all nations should have equal trading rights in China. American newspapers portrayed China as exotic and delicate, a place to be protected and exploited at the same time. The dainty China country can thus be read as a commentary on both the fragility of foreign cultures under imperialism and the brittle economics of global trade. It also highlights the peril of walking into delicate systems without understanding their rules. When the lion pushes his way through the China church, he accidentally topples it. This reflects how great powers can destroy institutions in lands they do not fully comprehend. One cannot examine the hidden horror of Oz without diving into the tragedies of the film adaptation. We have already touched on the physical dangers faced by the actors, but the psychological and economic abuse warrants further discussion. The Munchkin actors were paid less than the dog that played Toto. These actors were often typecast, ridiculed, and relegated to secondary status in Hollywood. Many had come from circuses and sideshows where exploitation was the norm. MGM promised them a family atmosphere, but segregated them into separate accommodations. Stories of their alleged drunkenness were sensationalized by the press, turning them into a punchline. Yet their heavy drinking can be understood as a response to lifelong marginalization. They were not allowed to speak freely on set. Their voices were dubbed over by professional singers. Even their joy in being part of a major production was tinged with humiliation. The film's success made millions for the studio, but not for the people who brought it to life. Even Judy Garland, who became an icon, saw little of the profits. She was bound by a contract that paid her a flat salary. She received no royalties from the endless re-releases and television broadcasts that followed. The control of the studio over her life extended into her personal relationships. She married band leader David Rose at 19, but the studio disapproved and exerted pressure. Her marriage was dissolved. Later, she married Vincente Minnelli, who directed Meet Me in St. Louis, another film produced under the strict control of the Hollywood machine. Her relationships were often publicized and manipulated by studio publicists. Meanwhile, she continued to struggle with addiction and mental health issues rooted in the abusive environment of her adolescence. When she collapsed after a performance in 1951, the studio executives who had once controlled her career were nowhere to be found. As the film world moved on, the themes of Oz continued to resonate in politics and economics. The Great Depression of the 1930s, which framed the 1939 film's release, was another era of deflation, unemployment, and despair. Banks failed again. Farmers lost their land in the Dust Bowl. The New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt introduced policies that echoed populist demands: public works, banking reforms, social security, and support for labor unions. One could imagine a new generation of audiences watching Dorothy and her friends with their own hardships in mind. They might see in the Emerald City the allure of a Washington that promised relief through Social Security and the Works Progress Administration. They might identify with the Tin Woodman's fear of losing his heart as men stood in bread lines while mechanized factories displaced workers. The Cowardly Lion might remind them of leaders who faltered in the face of economic collapse. The Good Witch of the North could be Roosevelt's government programs that helped lift them out of poverty. In this way, the allegory of Oz remained relevant, morphing with each crisis. The story's relevance did not end with the New Deal. During the 1970s, the United States abandoned the gold standard entirely, moving to a fiat currency system. Inflation replaced deflation as a feared enemy. The allegory of gold and silver lost its direct policy relevance, but gained a new layer of meaning. Oz could now be read as a caution about any system that concentrates power and hides its workings behind a curtain. The wizard could be a stand-in for the Federal Reserve, OPEC, or multinational corporations whose decisions affect millions but remain opaque. The winged monkeys might represent developing nations pushed into debt traps by international loans. Dorothy's silver shoes could be a reminder that citizens often hold more power than they realize, whether through voting, organizing, or consumer choices. The poppies might represent television and social media that lull people into apathy, while political charlatans shape their realities. In the early 21st century, The Wizard of Oz experienced yet another resurgence as audiences confronted the financial crisis of 2008. Home foreclosures, bank failures, and high unemployment echoed the panic of 1893. Pundits drew comparisons between 1890s populism and the Occupy Wall Street movement. Protesters in New York and across the world rallied against bankers and financiers they believed had gambled with ordinary people's lives. Signs at rallies depicted bankers as wicked witches and demanded that politicians pull back the curtain on Wall Street's dealings. The allegory gained new currency. Commentators revisited the populist movement with fresh eyes, considering whether William Jennings Bryan had been unfairly maligned as a crank when he argued for monetary policies that could have eased the pain of indebted farmers. Some progressives embraced him as a precursor to modern anti-corporate activism. Others cautioned that oversimplifying complex economic issues could lead to misguided policies. The hidden horror of Oz thus became a conversation starter about how economic myths and stories shape policy. The Wizard of Oz has also been examined through the lenses of race and gender. Although Baum's characters are mainly white and male, the story contains hints of deeper dynamics. The winged monkeys have been interpreted by some scholars as representing oppressed minorities. Their story is one of forced servitude after a foolish prank on a princess. In American history, Native Americans and enslaved Africans were subjugated through laws and violence. Baum himself wrote inflammatory editorials in his youth advocating for harsh treatment of Native Americans after the massacre at Wounded Knee. These writings cast a shadow on his later creation of a peaceful, multiracial utopia in Oz. They reveal the contradictions within the man, an advocate for children's morality who could also express genocidal ideas. The Wicked Witch's desire to control the winged monkeys with a golden cap could thus be seen as an allegory for the imposition of unjust treaties and the seizure of indigenous lands. Gender roles in Oz are also complex. Women are among the most powerful figures in the story. The witches, both good and wicked, and Dorothy herself. Yet the underlying narrative often returns to a patriarchal notion of womanhood. Dorothy is brave and kind, but her ultimate goal is to go home and resume her domestic life. The Good Witch of the North is wise, but does not accompany the travelers. She instead offers advice and sends them off. The Wicked Witch of the West is strong, but her thirst for power leads to her destruction. The film adaptation further emphasized domesticity by portraying Aunt Em and Uncle Henry as the stable center to which Dorothy must return. In a broader political allegory, the female characters can be read as representing the energies of movements that were often marginalized. Women were heavily involved in populist organizing and in the temperance movement. Bryan himself was influenced by his mother, Mary Elizabeth Bryan, a strong advocate for women's rights. The presence of powerful women in Oz may thus reflect the important but often overlooked role of women in political agitation. The horrors hidden in Oz therefore radiate outward in all directions. They connect to child labor, racial oppression, gender roles, addiction, imperialism, and the everlasting tug of war between capital and labor. They are encoded in every element of the story, from the silver shoes to the poppies, from the china figurines to the golden cap. They reveal that a simple children's story can contain multitudes, like a kaleidoscope reflecting different patterns as it turns. Each generation sees itself in Oz because the underlying issues persist. Farmers still struggle with debt and climate. Workers still fear being replaced by machines. Politicians still promise hope and deliver disappointment. People still look to wizards, be they presidents, celebrities, or financial gurus, and are often disillusioned. And children still read about Dorothy and her dog and dream of places over the rainbow, unaware that the rainbow arches over a history of pain and resilience. As this exploration deepens, one must also consider the personal history of L Frank Baum. He was a man of contradictions. Born into a wealthy family in New York, he had access to education and leisure. He tried his hand at various professions: actor, playwright, newspaper editor, salesman. He faced failures and setbacks. His time in the Dakota Territory exposed him to harsh winters and economic instability. His paper, the Saturday Pioneer, published editorials that called for the extermination of Native Americans after violent conflicts. Yet he also was a proponent of women's suffrage, influenced by his mother-in-law, Matilda Joslyn Gage, a prominent feminist. These conflicting views permeate his writing. Oz is a place where women hold power and animals speak, but it is also a place where some populations are enslaved. Baum's humanity and prejudices are entwined in the allegory, reminding us that authors are products of their time. Recognizing his blind spots adds another layer of horror to the story, exposing the biases that underlie beloved classics. Baum's business ventures also inform the allegory. Before writing Oz, he opened a store called Baum's Bazaar that sold household goods in South Dakota. When a severe drought hit, the local economy collapsed and the store went bankrupt. Baum moved to Chicago, where he worked as a traveling salesman. During the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, he saw displays of technological wonders and exotic cultures. The fair showcased electric lights, moving walkways, and grand pavilions. It also featured displays of people from colonized countries, reinforcing racial hierarchies. The fair's vision of progress at any cost influenced Baum's imagination. The Emerald City, with its gleaming towers and reliance on illusion, mirrors the spectacle of the Columbian Exposition. The horror lies in the way progress is built on exploitation, and in how visitors are dazzled by lights while ignoring the workers who installed them. The structure of Oz itself, its quadrants and roads, reflects the political geography of the United States at the time. The North, where the Gillikins live; the South, home of the Quadlings; the East, dominated by the Wicked Witch; and the West, ruled by another tyrant, mirror the regional alliances and divisions of the country. The yellow brick road snakes through them all, symbolizing how monetary policy reached into every corner. The characters cross rivers, mountains, and deserts, echoing the obstacles faced by voters and organizers traveling to conventions and rallies. Even the deadly desert that surrounds Oz and isolates it from other lands can be interpreted as the isolationist tendencies of American politics. The desert prevents outside influence, but it also traps the inhabitants within their economic system. The hidden horror is that self-imposed isolation can lead to stagnation and ignorance. The wizard's deception deserves sustained attention. At first he appears as omnipotent, but behind the screen he is a small man from Nebraska who traveled by balloon. He built his empire on trickery. He thrived on the gullibility of his subjects. This resonates with the Gilded Age of patent medicines and traveling shows that promised cures for all ailments but delivered little. In the late 19th century, snake oil salesmen peddled tonics made of alcohol and opiates. They used elaborate stagecraft to draw crowds. The wizard is part of that tradition. He knows how to exploit spectacle. In politics, this translates to the use of mass rallies, slogans, and promises to distract from the absence of substance. The hidden horror here is that gullibility can be weaponized, and that those who claim to offer solutions may be charlatans. Consider also the land of the Quadlings, which Baum describes as rich in natural resources. It is ruled by Glinda, the good witch of the south. She is wise and kind, but her power rests in her ability to use a golden cap to control the winged monkeys. The cap grants its owner 3 commands, after which it passes to another. In the allegory, this cap can represent the use of legal and political authority to coerce labor. Landowners and industrialists controlled workers through debt, contract, and law. They could call upon Pinkerton agents to break strikes or upon courts to issue injunctions. The 3 commands suggest the limited opportunities workers had to resist before being compelled to obey again. When Dorothy uses the cap, she commands the monkeys to carry her and her friends to safety, then to drive the witch's minions away, and finally to take the Scarecrow, Tin Woodman, and Lion to their new thrones. Her use of the cap symbolizes a temporary moment of collective action before power returns to those who control the means of coercion. The animals in Oz also carry symbolic weight. The cowardly lion is not the only speaking beast. In the forest, the travelers encounter a Khalida, a fierce creature with the body of a bear and the head of a tiger. They meet a giant spider that rules the jungle. They befriend a stork that rescues the Scarecrow. These animals may represent the forces of nature and industry that both threaten and assist the people. In the allegory, they could be the corporations that dominate entire sectors, the predators that feed on the weak, and the rare allies found in unexpected places. The lion's interactions with them reveal the dynamics of fear and bravery in the face of overwhelming power. His defeat of the spider, after the forest animals beg for relief, portrays the potential of collective action led by a courageous leader. Baum's sequels to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, while less well known, continue and deepen the allegory. In The Marvelous Land of Oz, a boy named Tip learns that he is actually Princess Ozma, rightful ruler of Oz, turned into a boy by a witch. This revelation invites reflection on gender roles and the fluidity of identity. In Ozma of Oz, Dorothy and her companions battle the Gnome King, who enslaves people by turning them into ornaments. The Gnome King symbolizes greed and imperialism. His underground kingdom is filled with riches. He despises people from the surface for taking his minerals. When Dorothy and the others visit, he offers them a game. Guess which ornaments are their friends. If they guess wrong, they are turned into ornaments themselves. This deadly game echoes the randomness of economic speculation and the dangers of playing with capital controlled by unseen forces. In The Emerald City of Oz, Baum describes how Oz closes itself off from the rest of the world to avoid invasion, a commentary on isolationism. Each sequel introduces new villains and challenges that mirror contemporary issues. They collectively remind readers that the work of confronting exploitation never ends. One could write entire volumes about the film's afterlives as well. After its initial release, The Wizard of Oz did not become an instant blockbuster. It performed moderately at the box office. It was only with repeated theatrical re-releases and later television broadcasts that it achieved iconic status. During the Cold War, when the film aired annually on television in the United States, it became a shared cultural experience. Families gathered around black and white sets to watch Dorothy step into a Technicolor world. For children growing up under the threat of nuclear war, Oz offered a haven. Yet even in that era, the story's subtext could be read through the lens of geopolitical conflict. The Wicked Witch could be seen as a stand-in for foreign adversaries. The Emerald City could represent Washington, with its opaque bureaucracies. The message that there is no place like home resonated strongly in a time when fear of the outside world was high. Hidden horror here is that narratives of innocence can be mobilized to support nationalist agendas. In more recent years, reinterpretations of Oz have explored alternative perspectives. Gregory Maguire's novel Wicked reimagines the Witch of the West as a misunderstood activist named Elphaba, born with green skin and persecuted for her difference. Maguire's story critiques the notion of inherent wickedness and reveals how propaganda shapes public perception. The stage adaptation, a wildly successful musical, further humanizes the witch and questions the authority of the wizard. In this telling, the hidden horror lies not in economic allegory, but in how societies ostracize those who deviate from norms. This reinterpretation speaks to contemporary audiences concerned with identity, injustice, and the narratives used to legitimize power. It also echoes populist warnings about how elites manipulate the truth to maintain control. Another avenue for expansion is to consider the global reception of Oz. The book and film have been translated into multiple languages and have found audiences far beyond the United States. In some countries, the allegory about American monetary policy may be lost or irrelevant, yet the story's themes of hope, struggle, and deception find resonance. In the Soviet Union, The Wizard of the Emerald City, a Russian adaptation, became a popular children's book. The Russian author, Alexander Volkov, kept many elements but altered others. His Tin Woodman was less melancholic, his lion more decisive. The story was imbued with values aligned with socialist ideals. The villain was greed itself. This adaptation demonstrates how the core narrative can be reshaped to serve different political agendas. The hidden horror is that even innocent tales can be repurposed to indoctrinate or inspire, depending on who controls the narrative. As we continue to peel back layers, we may also ponder how Oz serves as a meditation on technology and illusion. The Emerald City dazzles with a green glow, yet the color is created by glasses. The wizard uses levers and screens to project his image. Today's world is flooded with screens, holograms, and digital avatars. Political campaigns rely on social media, data analytics, and targeted messaging. Deep fakes can create convincing videos of people saying things they never said. The wizard's device is a primitive deepfake machine. His ability to manipulate perception presages the media manipulation of our era. The hidden horror is that our senses can be deceived on a mass scale, and that unscrupulous individuals can harness technology to create false realities. To tie everything together, one might imagine strolling through the land of Oz as if it were a museum of American economic and political trauma. Each exhibit would display an artifact, a pair of silver shoes representing the free silver movement, a yellow brick representing the gold standard, a dried stalk of corn representing the Dust Bowl, a rusted gear representing industrial accidents, a broken china doll representing imperialism, a poppy representing addiction. The museum would include a projection room showing footage of the 1896 Democratic National Convention, with Bryan thundering against the cross of gold. It would show workers in tenement sweatshops sewing garments until their fingers bled. It would show Chinese immigrants laying tracks across the Sierra Nevada. It would show Carusi hauling ore up dark shafts. It would show Judy Garland standing under bright lights, her eyes glazed from pills, singing about a place over the rainbow. The museum guide would explain that Oz is not just a fantasy world, but a repository of collective memory, a place where stories of suffering and hope are stored so that they are not forgotten. As one exits this imaginary museum, the guide might remind visitors that there is no place like home, and that home is not a static place, but a promise of safety and dignity. The journey home is not as simple as clicking heels. It requires collective action, courage, and a willingness to confront the horrors that lurk beneath pleasant narratives. Only by acknowledging the exploitation and injustice embedded in our stories can we hope to build a world where children's tales are not coded messages about suffering, but celebrations of freedom and equality. The hidden horror of The Wizard of Oz invites us to look behind the curtain of history and to use what we see to shape a more just future. To understand why the story of Oz resonated so deeply with those who lived through the turmoil of the late 19th century, we must linger over the details of that era's political battles. The most famous of those battles was the election of 1896, one of the most consequential contests in American history. On one side stood William McKinley, the Republican governor of Ohio, backed by industrialists and bankers who favored the gold standard and protective tariffs. On the other stood William Jennings Bryan, the young Democratic congressman from Nebraska, who swept through the party convention with a speech that electrified delegates. Bryan was also the candidate of the Populist Party, which had emerged a few years earlier from the Farmers' Alliance and other grassroots movements. The Populists had grown out of frustration with the two major parties' failures to address the hardships of rural and working people. Their platform in the 1892 election included demands for the free coinage of silver at a ratio of 16:1 with gold, a graduated income tax, public ownership of railroads, telegraphs, and telephones, the 8-hour workday, direct election of senators, and restrictions on immigration. They also called for the establishment of sub-treasuries that would lend money to farmers on the security of their crops, allowing them to store grain and wait for better prices. The populists' concern with monetary policy stemmed from the crime of '73, a term they used to describe the coinage Act of 1873. That law effectively demonetized silver by omitting it from the list of coins to be produced. In the years that followed, the supply of money relative to goods and services shrank, leading to deflation. Prices for agricultural commodities fell sharply, while interest rates remained high. The Bland-Allison Act of 1878 required the Treasury to buy limited amounts of silver and coin it, but the amounts were too small to reverse the deflationary trend. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 required the Treasury to buy even more silver, with notes redeemable in either gold or silver. For a time, this increased the money supply, but when silver prices fell and pressure on gold reserves increased, President Grover Cleveland called for its repeal. The repeal contributed to the Panic of 1893, as investors feared that the United States would run out of gold. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and unemployment skyrocketed. In 1894, Jacob Coxey led a march of unemployed workers to Washington, demanding that the government create jobs building roads. The marchers were arrested for walking on the grass. The state responded not with relief, but with repression. In this atmosphere, the populists sought an alliance with the Democrats to defeat the entrenched Republican establishment. At the Democratic National Convention of 1896 in Chicago, Bryan took to the stage to speak against the gold standard. His cross of gold speech was a masterclass in rhetoric. He spoke without notes, pacing and gesturing with fervor. His voice rose as he described the suffering of farmers and workers. He declared that the cities depended on the farms, not the other way around. He said that if the cities were burned, they would spring up again. But if the farms were destroyed, grass would grow in the streets of the cities. He warned against a policy that created a horde of bondholders by burdening the people with interest payments. When he reached his climax, he spread his arms like a crucifix and thundered, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The delegates leaped to their feet, waving hats and handkerchiefs, weeping and shouting. Reporters wrote that the speech turned the tide of the convention. Bryan was nominated on the fifth ballot. Newspapers owned by industrialists immediately attacked him as a demagogue. Political cartoons depicted him as a barefoot boy carrying a pitchfork. The New York banker J.P. Morgan remarked that if Bryan were elected, he would liquidate his holdings and move to Europe. McKinley's campaign manager, Mark Hanna, raised an unprecedented sum from business leaders and flooded the country with pamphlets and speeches praising stability and sound money. The campaign was a study in contrasts. Bryan traveled the country on a shoestring budget, giving speeches from the back of trains and in town squares. He campaigned in 27 states, sometimes delivering more than a dozen speeches in a single day. He appealed directly to voters, using plain language and religious imagery. McKinley, by contrast, stayed at home in Canton, Ohio, receiving delegations on his front porch. Business leaders paid for thousands of workers to take trains to Canton to hear McKinley speak. They distributed millions of pamphlets comparing the free coinage of silver to economic chaos. The Republican message emphasized prosperity through protective tariffs and a stable currency. It warned that free silver would lead to inflation and ruin savings. The Democrats and populists argued that controlled inflation would ease debts and spur economic activity. The choice came down to which group of suffering Americans the electorate believed. those who feared their savings would lose value, or those who feared their debts would never be paid. Bryan lost the election by a wide margin in the Electoral College, though the popular vote was closer. Many historians argue that the free silver issue masked deeper problems, such as overproduction in agriculture and the growing power of corporations. By the early 20th century, technological advances increased productivity, reducing the need for inflationary policies. The populist movement faded, but its ideas persisted. The direct election of senators became law through the 17th Amendment in 1913. The graduated income tax was established by the 16th Amendment. Antitrust laws were strengthened. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 to stabilize the money supply. Bryan remained active in politics, serving as Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson and later campaigning against evolution at the Scopes trial. His reputation fluctuated between heroic defender of the common man and misguided crusader. The Cowardly Lion's quest for courage, then, becomes a reflection on how reformers are perceived by posterity. As the populist movement rose and fell, other forms of exploitation continued unabated. One of the most brutal was the convict lease system in the American South. After the Civil War, Southern states passed black codes and vagrancy laws that criminalized unemployment and minor offenses. Courts sentenced black men to long terms of labor for trivial infractions. These convicts were then leased to private companies to work in mines, railroads, and plantations. Conditions were horrific. Prisoners were chained together, whipped, and starved. Mortality rates were high. The system generated revenue for states and profits for businesses, effectively re-enslaving thousands of freedmen. The practice continued into the early 20th century. When one considers the winged monkey's forced labor under the golden cap and the Winky's servitude to the wicked witch, it is impossible not to see parallels to the convict lease system. The horror was real and ongoing. The names may not be explicit in Baum's text, but the context was familiar to contemporary readers who had read exposés on convict leasing in newspapers. Other forms of forced labor existed outside the United States. In the Congo Free State, King Leopold II of Belgium ran a regime of terror to extract rubber and ivory. Villagers were forced to meet quotas under threat of mutilation. Hands were cut off as punishment for failing to produce enough rubber. Millions died. News of these atrocities reached the United States, sparking outrage among reformers, including Mark Twain. Baum may not have referenced the Congo directly, but his depiction of the Winkies as enslaved by the Witch of the West touches on the theme of colonial exploitation. Similarly, the plunder of resources in Latin America and Asia by European and American companies was widely reported. The opium trade in China, supported by British and American merchants, fueled addiction while lining the pockets of investors. The poppy field can thus be seen not only as a trap, but as a commentary on the way narcotics profits were prioritized over human well-being. Child labor was another practice that persisted despite populist protests. The National Child Labor Committee, founded in 1904, documented the conditions of children in mills, factories, and fields. Lewis Hines' photographs of children covered in lint at cotton mills, breaking stones in quarries, or working in glass factories awakened the public to the issue. He captured boys called breaker boys, sitting on wooden benches above coal chutes, their legs dangling over moving coal, plucking out pieces of slate with bleeding fingers. In rural areas, children worked from sunup to sundown, picking cotton, cutting sugarcane, or harvesting tobacco. Employers argued that children were needed to supplement family income and that work built character. Reformers countered that long hours stunted growth, prevented education, and perpetuated poverty. Although Congress passed laws limiting child labor, the Supreme Court struck down the first two acts as unconstitutional. It was not until the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 that national child labor laws were firmly established. Pinocchio's transformation into a donkey in Collodi's tale is an obvious comment on child labor. Baum's story, with its young heroine forced to confront adult burdens, also speaks to the heavy responsibilities placed on children. As we move forward in time, the exploitation of labor continued to adapt. During the early 20th century, the meatpacking industry in Chicago employed thousands of immigrants in dangerous conditions. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, exposed the filth and brutality of the stockyards. Workers sloshed through pools of blood, inhaled noxious fumes, and lost limbs in machinery. Sinclair's aim was to promote socialism, but readers were more horrified by the unsanitary conditions in which their meat was processed. The Food and Drug Administration was created in response. The Jungles expose parallels, the way the Oz allegory revealed hidden horrors behind a beloved story. It also illustrates how stories can spark reforms by arousing public outrage. In the 1930s, while Garland and her colleagues labored under MGM's control, millions of Americans were out of work. The Great Depression led to widespread hunger and homelessness. In 1932, a group of World War I veterans known as the Bonus Army marched to Washington to demand early payment of bonuses promised for their service. They set up camps on the Anacostia Flats. President Herbert Hoover ordered the army to clear them out. Soldiers, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, used tear gas and burned the camps. Public opinion turned against Hoover. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal provided relief in the form of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which employed young men to build parks and roads. The Public Works Administration, which constructed bridges and schools, and the Works Progress Administration, which hired artists, writers, and actors. The Federal Theatre Project produced plays that highlighted social issues. One could argue that, had Baum lived to see it, he would have recognized in the New Deal a partial realization of populist goals: government intervention to alleviate suffering, public investment in infrastructure, and regulation of industry. Meanwhile, the film industry matured. After the advent of sound in the late 1920s, studios consolidated their control over distribution and exhibition. The Production Code, enforced from 1934, imposed strict guidelines on content, banning scenes of excessive violence, sexual innuendo, and criticism of religious institutions. The code created a sanitized world on screen that often bore little resemblance to reality. The Wizard of Oz, produced under this system, omitted references to alcohol or profanity. It presented a world where good and evil were clearly delineated and where justice prevailed. Behind the scenes, however, the industry exploited actors. Contracts typically bound performers for 7 years, during which they could be loaned to other studios without their consent. Studios dictated hair color, weight, and even personal relationships. Actors who disobeyed risked suspension, which extended their contracts. Women were particularly vulnerable. Actresses like Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, and Rita Hayworth were sexualized on screen and controlled off it. Garland, once she aged out of juvenile roles, struggled to find parts. The pressure to maintain a youthful appearance contributed to her substance use and mental health issues. The tragedies did not end with Garland. In the decades after the film's release, many cast members faced hardship. Burt Lahr, who played the Cowardly Lion, had a successful stage career but struggled with depression. Ray Bolger, the Scarecrow, found steady work in film and television, but never again achieved the level of fame he had in Oz. Jack Haley, the Tin Man, suffered from health issues related to his makeup and retired early. Margaret Hamilton, the Wicked Witch, was typecast as a villain and found it difficult to obtain roles that showcased her range. The actors who played Munchkins returned to lives of obscurity, some continuing to perform in circuses and sideshows. Their brief moment of fame did not translate into long-term security. The dog who played Toto was paid more than most of them. These outcomes highlight the disparity between the film's message of home and the reality for those who made it. Beyond film, Oz continued to influence American culture. In the 1960s and 1970s, the story was embraced by counterculture movements. The Yellow Brick Road was reimagined as the path of psychedelic exploration. The poppy field became a metaphor for drug experiences. Musicians referenced the story in songs. The band America sang about Oz in Tin Man, reflecting on the search for hearts and minds. Elton John released the album Goodbye Yellow Brick Road in 1973, with lyrics lamenting disillusionment with fame and wealth. The film The Wiz, released in 1978, reinterpreted Oz through a black lens, featuring an all-black cast and setting the story in an urban environment. Dorothy became a schoolteacher from Harlem. The Cowardly Lion roared through a version of the New York Public Library. The production highlighted issues of racial discrimination and urban decay. The hidden horror here shifts from economic collapse to systemic racism, proving that the allegory can be adapted to reflect different struggles. The allegory has also been used to critique imperialism and war. During the Vietnam War, protesters carried signs depicting President Lyndon Johnson as the wizard, hiding behind a curtain while soldiers died abroad. Artists created posters showing Dorothy dropping bombs on Southeast Asia. They argued that the government had lured the country down a yellow brick road of anti-communism that led to destruction. In this interpretation, the Wicked Witch could be the Viet Cong in official propaganda, while in reality, the conflict was more complex. Similarly, the poppy field could represent heroin addiction among soldiers, many of whom returned home, struggling with substance use. The use of Oz to critique war demonstrates the story's flexibility and the universality of its symbols. Education reformers have also invoked Oz. Teachers have used the story to illustrate the dangers of standardized testing. The Tin Woodman is presented as a child who can perform tasks but lacks creativity. The Scarecrow as a student who is curious but discouraged. The Lion as a student who is passionate but anxious. The Wizard as the testing regime that pretends to measure ability but actually measures obedience. The Yellow Brick Road becomes the curriculum path that students must follow or risk failure. Critics argue that this path stifles individuality and critical thinking. The hidden horror here is the reduction of education to mechanistic processes that do not nourish hearts or minds. Psychologists and therapists have explored Oz as a tool for discussing trauma. Dorothy's journey can be seen as a metaphor for recovery from adversity. She is displaced from her home by a traumatic event. She experiences fear and uncertainty. She meets allies who help her develop cognitive, emotional, and behavioral skills. She confronts her fears. She learns that she already has the power to return to safety. In trauma-informed care, clients are encouraged to find their own brains, hearts, and courage. The wizard represents external validation that is ultimately revealed to be empty. The therapeutic message is that true healing comes from within and from supportive relationships, not from authorities who may promise quick fixes. The hidden horror is the false belief that trauma can be erased by a benevolent figure rather than processed through personal growth and community support. Religious commentators have likewise found meaning in Oz. Some see Dorothy's journey as an allegory for the Christian path, with the yellow brick road as the narrow way, the Emerald City as the kingdom of heaven, and the wizard as a false prophet. Others view it through a secular spiritual lens, interpreting Glinda as a goddess figure who empowers Dorothy. Still others see in the Land of Oz a parody of utopian visions that fail to address human nature. These interpretations reveal how a single story can accommodate diverse spiritual and philosophical insights. The horror emerges when such interpretations are weaponized to condemn or control others. For instance, some religious groups have banned the book and film for depicting witches and magic, fearing they encourage occultism. The banning of books has its own history of repression and censorship, often targeting stories that challenge authority. In this context, Oz becomes a symbol of intellectual freedom under threat. As we ponder the multi-layered symbolism of Oz, we must return to the message that the characters already have what they seek. This message can be empowering, but it can also be used to shift responsibility onto individuals instead of acknowledging systemic barriers. Telling workers that they simply need to find courage or brains ignores the structural reasons they are exploited. It overlooks the need for collective action. The allegory thus contains a potential trap. By focusing on personal growth, it can obscure the broader political context. Reform movements of the past and present remind us that courage, empathy, and intelligence must be coupled with organization, policy changes, and accountability for those in power. Only then can the cycle of exploitation be broken. The wizard's hot air balloon is another motif worth analyzing. In the book, he offers to take Dorothy home in his balloon, but she misses her chance, and he floats away. Balloons were a symbol of progress and adventure in the 19th century. The balloon at the Chicago World's Fair amazed visitors. It suggested the possibility of flight and escape. At the same time, balloons can represent empty promises, full of hot air. The wizard's departure leaves the citizens of the Emerald City without a leader, revealing that they never needed his leadership in the first place. In political terms, it warns against reliance on charismatic individuals and emphasizes self-governance. The hidden horror here is the abandonment of people by leaders who were never committed to their well-being. When Dorothy finally learns the secret of the silver shoes, she discovers that she could have returned home at any time. Some readers interpret this as an indictment of ignorance. If only the populace understood monetary policy, they could alleviate their suffering. Others see it as a commentary on the importance of self-belief. The Good Witch of the South tells Dorothy that she did not reveal the shoe's power earlier because Dorothy would not have believed her. In this reading, people must learn through experience before they can accept solutions. The hidden horror is that knowledge withheld can prolong suffering. Glinda's choice to withhold information raises ethical questions about paternalism in leadership. Should those in power decide when the masses are ready to understand policies that affect them? The question resonates today as governments and corporations manage information about public health, economics, and climate change. The yellow brick road itself warrants further reflection. Roads are instruments of connection and control. They facilitate commerce, migration, and communication. In the late 19th century, railroads were the roads of commerce. They opened up new territories to settlers. They allowed farmers to ship their crops to distant markets. They also monopolized access and charged high freight rates. The populists demanded that railroads be regulated or nationalized. They saw the rails as veins through which the lifeblood of the economy flowed, veins that had been captured by monopolists. The yellow brick road, gleaming and inviting, could therefore represent infrastructure controlled by financial elites. Dorothy follows it because it is the only path she knows. If she steps off, she is told she will get lost. The hidden horror lies in the lack of alternatives. Economic systems are often presented as the only viable paths, leaving little room to imagine new structures. When Dorothy discovers that she could have flown home, it suggests that other routes were possible all along. The color symbolism in Oz is rich: yellow for gold, silver for money, green for paper, red for rebellion. In the book, Dorothy's shoes are silver and the road is yellow. In the film, the shoes are ruby red. Red is the color of socialism and revolution. Could the ruby slippers hint at more radical solutions than those offered by bimetallism? The color change was made for cinematic reasons, but it inadvertently resonates with the Red Scare that would grip America in the 1950s. Green-tinted glasses in the Emerald City symbolize how perception can be manipulated. In modern terms, the glasses are algorithms that filter information. Social media feeds are curated, giving each user a different view of reality. The Emerald City, seen through tinted lenses, is an echo chamber. The hidden horror is that we may all be walking through our own curated emerald cities, unaware of the machinery shaping our perceptions. Another dimension of the Oz story concerns the interplay between humans and nature. The natural world in Oz is both beautiful and dangerous. Trees throw apples at the travelers when they pick fruit without consent. The river sweeps the raft toward waterfalls. The poppies overwhelm travelers with their scent. Animals speak and hold councils. In the late 19th century, humans' relationship with nature was changing rapidly. Industrialization transformed landscapes. Deforestation, mining, and irrigation altered ecosystems. Farmers' exhaustion of soil nutrients led to erosion and dust storms. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s, caused by drought and poor agricultural practices, forced thousands to migrate. Dorothy's cyclone foreshadows such environmental disasters. The Wicked Witch's winged monkeys could be seen as storms unleashed by natural forces that humans provoke. In this light, the hidden horror of Oz is also ecological. The yellow brick road cuts through forests and fields, symbolizing the imposition of human infrastructure on nature. The story invites readers to consider how economic pursuits impact the environment and how ignoring natural limits can lead to catastrophe. One might also analyze the role of music in the film adaptation. Songs like Over the Rainbow express longing for a place beyond trouble. Music functions as a form of escape and solace. During the Great Depression, radio broadcasts of songs lifted spirits. Judy Garland's voice carried warmth and hope. Yet behind the soothing melody lies pain. The song was nearly cut from the film because executives thought it slowed the pace. They did not understand that its emotional resonance anchored the film. Garland fought to keep it. Her performance turned the song into an anthem for those yearning for a better world. The hidden horror emerges when one knows that Garland herself was desperately seeking a place where she could be free from the pressures of the studio. The song becomes a cry for help, a plea for home that she never truly found. In exploring the hidden horror of The Wizard of Oz, we cannot ignore the role of the audience. Stories do not exist in isolation. They are activated by readers and viewers. Each person brings their own experiences, biases, and desires to the story. A banker in Boston reading the book in 1900 might chuckle at the idea of free silver. A tenant farmer in Kansas might see his struggles reflected in the scarecrow. A child in 1939 might be enchanted by the Munchkins and fear the Wicked Witch. A young woman in the 1960s might identify with Dorothy's sense of entrapment and long for liberation. A protester in 2011 might chant, "We are the 99%," while picturing the wizard as a Wall Street executive. The horror of exploitation and deception is thus perpetuated or challenged by the interpretations people choose. The story's endurance suggests that its core truths remain unresolved. Each audience sees new horrors because the underlying structures of power continue to evolve but not disappear. Finally, there is a meta-narrative at play. The very act of uncovering hidden allegories can itself become a kind of obsession. Scholars have debated whether Baum intentionally crafted an allegory. Some argue that he was merely writing a fairy tale. Others contend that he could not have woven so many parallels by accident. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Authors often absorb the world around them and unconsciously embed its patterns into their work. Readers, in turn, find meaning based on their own context. There is a danger in overfitting allegory to every detail, of turning fiction into a rigid code. Yet there is also value in exploring how stories reflect and shape reality. When one focuses on the hidden horror of The Wizard of Oz, one engages in a tradition of reading between the lines to uncover social critique. This tradition is vital to democracy and justice. It encourages skepticism toward those who claim to have all the answers. It invites empathy for those who suffer unseen. It reminds us that even in the brightest of tales, there may be darkness waiting to be acknowledged and addressed. This long examination of Oz thus circles back to the beginning. A tornado in Kansas. A girl lifted out of her world. Companions seeking what they already have. A city shimmering with false promise. And a man behind a curtain. The story is as much about the world in which it was written as it is about the world in which we live. Economic collapse, political exploitation, child labor, addiction, imperialism, environmental degradation, and media manipulation are not relics of the past. They continue to shape our lives. The hidden horror of The Wizard of Oz is not just a reflection on a single moment in history. It is a reminder that we must always look beneath the surface question authority, support each other, and work collectively to create a world where the yellow brick roads we follow do not lead us into traps, where wizards cannot hide behind curtains, and where every girl from Kansas has the resources and support she needs to weather the storms that life inevitably brings. The hidden horror of The Wizard of Oz continues to unfurl when one turns to the side characters and locales that populate Baum's expansive universe. Many readers are unaware that The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was only the first of 14 books Baum wrote about the Land of Oz. In those sequels, he introduced dozens of new characters whose own stories echo economic and political struggles. The Gnome King, for example, is one of the most memorable antagonists. He lives underground and hoards precious gems and metals. He despises the people of Oz because they dare to dig into his kingdom and extract resources. In Ozma of Oz and the Emerald City of Oz, the Gnome King attempts to invade the Emerald City and enslave its inhabitants. Scholars have interpreted the Gnome King as representing monopolistic industrialists or mining magnates who control natural resources and employ violence to protect their wealth. He could also represent the notion that the wealth of a nation lies underground, controlled by those who claim ownership. The Gnome King's hatred of sunlight and fresh air mirrors the secretive nature of corporate elites who operate in shadows. Defeating him requires not brute force, but cleverness and solidarity among Oz citizens who work together to push back against his invasion. This cooperative resistance reflects the organizing strategies of labor unions and social movements. Another group of characters, the Hammerheads, appear in The Wizard of Oz as inhabitants of the Hill of the Hammerheads. They are described as having long, rubbery necks and hard heads that they use to repel intruders. They refuse to let the travelers pass through their territory. Some interpretations see the Hammerheads as representing nativists or protectionists who block outsiders from entering. In the 1890s, nativist groups, like the American Protective Association, sought to limit immigration, particularly of Catholics and Asians. They argued that newcomers threatened American jobs and culture. Politicians responded by passing laws such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and literacy tests. The Hammerheads' rigid defense of their land and their use of blunt force instead of dialogue reflect the close-mindedness of those who build walls to keep others out. In the story, the travelers bypass the Hammerheads by using the winged monkeys, suggesting that cooperation with oppressed groups can overcome exclusionary barriers. The deadly desert surrounding Oz is more than just a geographical feature. It serves as a metaphor for economic isolation and protectionism. On one level, it represents the physical challenges of travel and trade in a vast country. In the 19th century, deserts and mountains separated communities, limiting commerce and communication. Railroads and canals were built to overcome these barriers, but they also created dependencies on those who owned them. On another level, the deadly desert symbolizes the barriers the United States erected around its economy through tariffs and immigration restrictions. Protectionist policies were intended to shield domestic industries, but sometimes had the effect of isolating the country from global markets and perpetuating inefficiencies. In the Oz series, characters occasionally venture beyond the desert into lands that are strange and dangerous, reflecting the risks and opportunities of international engagement. The desert thus captures the tension between self-sufficiency and global integration. A further aspect of Oz that invites analysis is the travelling troupe of characters who join the journey in the 1903 musical adaptation and subsequent works. The stage musical introduced characters like King Pastoria, who claimed to be the rightful ruler of Oz, and Trixie Trifle, a waitress. These additions reveal the fluidity of narratives and the influence of commercial interests. The producers of the musical sought to capitalize on the success of the book by adding romantic subplots and comic relief to attract audiences. In doing so, they diluted the political allegory and emphasized entertainment. Yet even in this dilution, traces of social commentary remain. Trixie Trifle, for instance, represents the working-class woman serving others without recognition. King Pastoria's claims to the throne mirror disputes over legitimacy and succession that plagued monarchies and corporations alike. The musical also highlights the synergy between art and commerce. The 1903 stage adaptation toured the country, making Baum's creation a national phenomenon. The show's success demonstrates how a narrative can be commodified and how its meaning can shift in the process. The producers of the musical added songs and jokes that spoke to contemporary audiences, but stripped away references to bimetallism. When The Wizard of Oz moved from page to stage to screen, each adaptation served different purposes. The book offered a social critique disguised as a fairy tale. The musical served as a spectacle for mass entertainment. The film served as both a celebration of cinema's capabilities and a vehicle for studio profit. The story's capacity to generate revenue is itself part of the hidden horror. Works that critique exploitation can be repackaged by the exploiters for their own gain. Another layer emerges when we consider the phrase "friend of Dorothy," which became a code word in the mid-20th century for gay men and, later, for LGBTQ communities. In an era when homosexuality was criminalized and persecuted, gay men needed discreet ways to identify each other. The phrase drew upon Judy Garland's status as a gay icon and the film's themes of friendship and belonging. The appropriation of Dorothy as a symbol of solidarity illustrates how marginalized groups find refuge in popular culture. The hidden horror is that such solidarity was necessary because of widespread discrimination and violence. The Stonewall Uprising of 1969, a pivotal moment in the fight for LGBTQ rights, occurred the same month Judy Garland died. Mourners at her funeral and protesters in the streets drew strength from her music and from the sense of chosen family that the Oz narrative embodied. The fact that a story about home and acceptance became a secret password for a persecuted community underscores the enduring resonance of Oz and the ongoing struggle for basic rights. Turning to L Frank Baum's personal beliefs, some scholars have noted his interest in theosophy, a spiritual movement founded by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century. Theosophy blended Eastern and Western religious ideas, emphasizing reincarnation, karma, and the existence of hidden masters guiding humanity's evolution. Baum and his wife attended theosophical lectures and were friends with the movement's leaders. The influence of theosophy can be seen in Oz's emphasis on self-discovery and the idea that true power lies within. Theosophy also promoted universal brotherhood and the idea that all religions share a common truth. However, it carried problematic elements, including racial hierarchies that placed white Europeans at the top of spiritual evolution. Baum's engagement with theosophy adds complexity to the allegory. It suggests that his political critique was intertwined with a spiritual vision of self-actualization. The hidden horror here is that spiritual movements often reflect and reinforce the prejudices of their time while providing tools for personal empowerment. Another aspect worth exploring is the reaction to Henry Littlefield's allegory thesis. When Littlefield published his article in 1964, it ignited a lively debate among historians, economists, and literary scholars. Critics argued that Littlefield was reading too much into a simple children's story. They pointed out that Baum never publicly stated that he intended an allegory and that some of the parallels might be coincidental. Supporters of the thesis countered that Baum lived through the populist movement and was familiar with its symbolism. They noted that the choice of silver shoes and a yellow road could hardly be accidental. The debate highlights the challenges of interpreting texts. Authors are not always aware of the ways their works reflect the world around them. Readers bring their own contexts, making interpretation a dynamic process. The controversy also reflects broader cultural tensions between those who view stories as apolitical entertainment and those who see them as products of social and political conditions. The hidden horror arises when interpretations become battlegrounds, with factions fighting over the meaning of a work, sometimes ignoring the lived experiences that inform it. The transformation of Oz into a global brand raises further questions about the commodification of culture. Merchandise ranging from dolls to lunchboxes to snow globes has turned Oz into a commodity. Theme parks, museum exhibits, and tourist attractions capitalize on the story's popularity. For example, the town of Liberal, Kansas, claims to be the home of Dorothy's house and features a museum where visitors can walk the yellow brick road. In the 1980s, an amusement park called Land of Oz operated on Beach Mountain in North Carolina, complete with Emerald City and costumed characters. These attractions package Oz as nostalgic entertainment, removing any trace of political critique. The commercial appropriation of Oz demonstrates how market forces can strip a story of its subversive elements and sell it back as innocuous fun. The hidden horror is the erasure of history and meaning in the pursuit of profit. In the sphere of education, Oz has been used as a tool for teaching economics. Professors assign the book to illustrate concepts like deflation, monetary policy, and the role of expectations. Students discuss the symbolism of the yellow brick road and the silver shoes, analyzing how bimetallism might have influenced prices. They debate whether the populists' monetary proposals would have achieved their goals. The story becomes a case study in the interplay between politics and economics. While this pedagogical use keeps the allegory alive, it risks simplifying the populist movement to a single issue. Populism was about more than free silver. It was about power, democracy, and dignity. Reducing it to a monetary debate can obscure its social justice roots. The hidden horror is the reduction of a multifaceted struggle to a simplistic model, losing sight of the human pain that inspired it. The intersection of Oz with racial dynamics requires further exploration. In the early 20th century, minstrel shows and vaudeville performances caricatured African Americans and immigrants, perpetuating stereotypes. Some stage adaptations of Oz employed blackface performers or racist caricatures. The 1925 silent film The Wizard of Oz, starring Oliver Hardy, depicted the farmhands as caricatures of plantation workers. The use of blackface in entertainment reflects the pervasive racism of the era. When a story that critiques exploitation is performed in a way that exploits and dehumanizes a group of people, the irony is staggering. In the 1978 film The Wiz, black artists reclaimed the story, infusing it with the experiences and voices of black Americans. The film featured music rooted in soul and funk, choreography inspired by African American dance, and themes addressing urban poverty and social justice. By reimagining Oz in Harlem, The Wiz confronted the racism embedded in earlier adaptations and offered a vision of liberation that resonated with black audiences. The hidden horror is that such reclamation was necessary because of decades of exclusion and misrepresentation. Health and disability issues in Oz provide another dimension for analysis. The Tin Woodman's lack of a heart and the Scarecrow's lack of a brain can be read through a disability studies lens. These characters believe they are deficient because of societal expectations. Disability scholars argue that the problem lies not within the individual, but within a society that defines normalcy narrowly and fails to accommodate difference. The Tin Woodman functions perfectly well without a biological heart, demonstrating compassion and empathy despite his belief that he lacks these traits. The Scarecrow devises solutions and displays creativity despite doubting his intelligence. Their quests for missing parts mirror the experiences of disabled individuals seeking acceptance in a world that tells them they are broken. The wizard's false gifts symbolize the futility of conforming to societal standards. The hidden horror is the internalization of negative messages by those deemed defective and the harm of false cures offered by charlatans. From a psychological perspective, the Oz narrative can be interpreted as a hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, in his work on mythology, outlined a monomyth in which the hero receives a call to adventure, crosses a threshold into a special world, faces trials, receives aid from helpers, confronts a supreme ordeal, gains rewards, and returns home transformed. Dorothy fits this pattern. She is called to adventure by the cyclone, crosses into Oz, faces obstacles, is aided by friends, confronts witches and wizards, learns a secret, and returns home with new wisdom. Campbell's model, however, has been criticized for its universality and lack of attention to cultural specificity. In reading Oz as a hero's journey, one risks overlooking the particular historical and economic factors that shape the story. The hidden horror is the erasure of context in favor of a universal template that may not fit all narratives. The gender dynamics of the 1939 film deserve deeper scrutiny. While the film portrays Dorothy as brave and resourceful, it also subjects her to a narrative where men hold authority. The wizard, Professor Marvel, the farmhands, and even Toto, who is male in the film, occupy positions of influence. Dorothy receives guidance from Glinda and confronts a female villain, the Wicked Witch. The story pits women against each other, reinforcing the trope of women in conflict. Meanwhile, the male characters vacillate between supporters and deceivers. The film does not explore the experiences of Aunt Em beyond her domestic duties. In contrast, the Oz books feature more prominent female leaders, such as Ozma and Glinda, who rule with wisdom and compassion. This shift reflects Hollywood's patriarchal tendencies. The hidden horror is the way in which film adaptations can reinforce gender stereotypes, even when the source material challenges them. Comparative mythology offers another avenue for discussion. Scholars have noted similarities between the Land of Oz and other utopian or fantastical realms, such as Plato's Atlantis, Thomas More's Utopia, and James Hilton's Shangri-La. These places promise peace, abundance, and harmony, yet they often contain internal contradictions or rely on exclusion. Atlantis is a cautionary tale about hubris. Utopia requires the elimination of private property and the enforcement of social order. Shangri-La is isolated and inaccessible. Oz appears idyllic but hides oppression. Comparing these worlds reveals a pattern. Utopias in literature often serve to critique existing societies by exaggerating their strengths and flaws. The hidden horror in utopias is that perfection is illusory and may depend on exploitation or isolation. The idea of home is central to Oz. Dorothy's mantra, "There is no place like home," has become a cultural catchphrase. Home symbolizes safety, familiarity, and belonging. For many migrants and refugees, however, home is a place they cannot return to due to war, persecution, or climate change. Dorothy's ability to return to Kansas by clicking her heels contrasts with the plight of those who are permanently displaced. The hidden horror is that home is not guaranteed. Policies that create refugees and economic migrants force people to seek new homes, often facing hostility in their destinations. The concept of home thus becomes political. Who is allowed to have a home? Who must wander? Dorothy's simple wish resonates with millions who long for stability yet are denied it. Memory and forgetting also play roles in the Oz mythos. In subsequent books, Baum reveals that Dorothy's family did not believe her tales of Oz. The neighbors mock her, believing she dreamed it all. The tension between memory and skepticism reflects the difficulty of convincing others of lived experiences that fall outside their own. In a political context, this is akin to marginalized groups recounting abuse or exploitation only to be dismissed by those in power. The hidden horror is the invalidation of trauma and the gaslighting of victims. In literature, memory is often contested territory. Histories are written by the victors. Counter-narratives struggle to gain recognition. Oz thus becomes a site of contested memory, where the question of what is real and what is fantasy mirrors debates over historical truth. Looking beyond the United States, one can examine how other countries interpreted Oz through their own political lenses. In Australia, which experienced its own gold rush and debates over monetary policy, readers identified with the themes of resource exploitation and government deception. In Brazil, where populist leaders like Getulio Vargas held power, the story's critique of authoritarianism resonated. In South Africa, where apartheid created a stark division between reality and the rhetoric of racial harmony, Oz was read as a commentary on the gap between the dream of a rainbow nation and the harshness of segregation. Each context reveals new horrors and new hopes. The adaptability of the allegory underscores its universality and its capacity to address diverse injustices. Furthermore, Oz functions as a lens for examining the media's role in shaping perceptions of crises. During the 1890s, newspapers were the primary source of news. Publishers like William Randolph Hearst used sensational headlines to influence public opinion. Hearst's support for the Spanish-American War in 1898 exemplifies how media can drum up support for conflict. In Oz, the people of the Emerald City believe whatever the wizard tells them, as long as they wear green glasses. This parallels the public's reliance on newspapers filtered through the biases of their publishers. In the 21st century, social media platforms act as the Emerald City's spectacles, curating news feeds and amplifying sensational stories. Conspiracy theories thrive when people fail to look behind the curtain. The hidden horror is that misinformation can perpetuate cycles of fear and division, undermining democratic processes. Finally, we must consider the role of resilience and solidarity in confronting horrors. Dorothy does not conquer Oz alone. She is aided by the Scarecrow's cleverness, the Tin Woodman's compassion, the Lion's bravery, the Winged Monkey's support, and Glinda's wisdom. Each character brings a strength that compensates for another's weakness. This cooperation reflects the populist emphasis on coalition building across class lines. Farmers, industrial workers, and small business owners were encouraged to unite against monopolies. In the modern world, alliances across race, gender, class, and nationality are necessary to confront global challenges like climate change, economic inequality, and pandemics. The allegory teaches that fear and ignorance can be overcome when people share knowledge and resources. The hidden horror would be to ignore this lesson and allow divisions to prevent collective action. To extend the theme of solidarity, consider how labor movements have used songs and stories to unify members. The Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, founded in 1905, published songbooks to be sung at strikes and meetings. The most famous, Solidarity Forever, to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, contains verses about the power of collective action and the futility of trusting bosses or politicians. In similar fashion, the Oz story served as an organizing tool for Littlefield's students when he taught it as a parable of populism. The narrative provided a memorable framework to discuss complex economic issues. Music and stories allow people to internalize ideas emotionally and intellectually. The hidden horror is that when such cultural tools are co-opted by those in power, they can lose their radical edge and become instruments of conformity. In the realm of law, the Oz allegory touches on questions of rights and justice. The Scarecrow's belief that he has no brain reflects how the legal system once deemed certain groups intellectually inferior, justifying their exclusion from voting or holding office. Literacy tests and poll taxes were used to disenfranchise black voters in the South. Women were denied suffrage until 1920 in the United States. Native Americans were not granted full citizenship until 1924. In many states, property requirements barred poor white men from voting well into the 19th century. The populists demanded expanded voting rights and contested laws that privileged the wealthy. Dorothy's ability to navigate Oz relies on alliances with those who have been told they are unworthy. The hidden horror is the persistence of laws and policies that disenfranchise marginalized communities under the guise of maintaining order or preventing fraud. Cultural memory is further shaped by references to Oz in political discourse. Politicians have quoted the story for rhetorical effect. During the Watergate scandal, Senator Sam Ervin remarked that the investigation had pulled the curtain aside to reveal the dark workings of the Nixon administration. In debates over campaign finance reform, reformers have invoked the wizard to criticize politicians controlled by donors. As climate change accelerates, Activists warn that ignoring scientific warnings is like ignoring the man behind the curtain while focusing on the spectacle. These references demonstrate the enduring potency of Oz as a cultural shorthand for deception and revelation. The hidden horror is that despite repeated warnings, societies often fail to act until disaster strikes. To bring this exploration to a close, it is worth reiterating that the hidden horror of The Wizard of Oz is not a single truth, but a constellation of interconnected themes. It encompasses economic exploitation, political betrayal, environmental destruction, social marginalization, and the struggle for self-determination. It invites readers to look beyond the glittering surfaces of their own world and to question the narratives that justify inequality. By tracing the myriad interpretations and adaptations of Oz, we see that each generation finds new meaning in the story because the underlying patterns of power and resistance remain. Our task is not only to decode the allegory, but to use its lessons to challenge the wizards of our time, to dissolve the poppy-induced sleep of complacency, and to forge pathways that do not lead us back to the same cycle of false hope and hidden horror. Delving further into the historical background of the Wizard of Oz, one must consider the broader context of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. The late 19th century was a time of rapid industrialization, unprecedented wealth accumulation, and stark inequality. Industrialists like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan built vast fortunes through oil, steel, and finance. Their corporations consolidated markets, eliminated competition, and wielded immense political influence. Workers toiled long hours under dangerous conditions for meager wages. Labor unrest was common. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 erupted after companies cut wages amid a depression. Strikers halted trains in multiple states. State militias and federal troops intervened, killing dozens of workers. The Haymarket Affair of 1886 began as a peaceful rally for the 8-hour workday in Chicago and ended with a bomb and a violent police crackdown. The Pullman strike of 1894 started when the Pullman Company lowered wages without reducing rents in its company town. Railroad workers walked out, and the American Railway Union called a boycott. The federal government deployed troops to break the strike, leading to deaths and injuries. Court injunctions ordered strikers back to work, and union leaders were jailed. These events fueled calls for reform and exposed the tensions between capital and labor. Within this tumultuous environment, populists were not alone in demanding change. The Knights of Labour, formed in 1869, sought to unite workers across trades to fight for fair wages and improved conditions. The American Federation of Labour, founded in 1886, focused on skilled workers and bargained for better pay and hours. The Women's Christian Temperance Union linked temperance with women's rights, arguing that alcohol abuse contributed to domestic violence and poverty. Mary Elizabeth Lease, a prominent populist orator, famously urged farmers to raise less corn and more hell. She spoke at rallies, condemning railroads, banks, and monopolies. Lease's fiery speeches energized audiences, but drew criticism from male politicians who found her assertiveness unseemly. Her presence in the movement underscores the role of women in populist organizing. These activists recognized that economic issues were intertwined with gender, race, and class. Their demands included public ownership of railroads and telegraphs, a national currency, and the abolition of private banks. the Populist Party achieved notable successes. In the 1892 election, populist candidate James B. Weaver won more than 1 million votes and carried 5 western states. Populists gained seats in Congress and elected governors and legislators in several states. They enacted reforms like railroad regulation, antitrust laws, and public boarding schools. However, internal divisions weakened the movement. Some members prioritized monetary reforms like free silver. Others emphasized land and railroad policies. The party struggled to bridge racial divisions in the South, where Democrats used racism to divide poor whites and blacks. Populist attempts to build interracial alliances were met with violence. In 1892, white supremacists in North Carolina destroyed the populist Republican fusion government that had enacted progressive reforms. Racial tensions, combined with strategic mistakes and opposition from established parties, led to the populist decline after 1896. Yet their ideas influenced subsequent progressive reforms, including the direct election of senators, income tax, and regulation of monopolies. Meanwhile, debates over America's role in the world intensified. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked the United States' emergence as a global power. After defeating Spain, the United States annexed Puerto Rico and Guam, purchased the Philippines, and claimed influence over Cuba. These acquisitions sparked debates over imperialism. Anti-imperialists argued that controlling overseas territories contradicted American ideals of self-determination. William Jennings. Bryan opposed annexation of the Philippines, arguing that a republic cannot both serve liberty and rule subject peoples. He supported Cuban independence, but criticized the war's imperialist outcomes. In contrast, expansionists like Theodore Roosevelt celebrated the war as a demonstration of national strength. The treatment of the Winkies and the portrayal of the Gnome King's underground realm in Oz echo these imperialist tensions. The exploitation of natural resources and the subjugation of indigenous people in the Philippines and other colonies mirror the experiences of fictional characters under oppressive rulers. The cultural atmosphere of the Gilded Age also shaped Baum's writing. World's fairs, such as the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, showcased technological innovations and exotic displays. These events promoted nationalism and consumerism. Fair exhibits included living displays of people from colonized regions, reinforcing racist hierarchies. Visitors marveled at electric lights, moving walkways, and giant wheels. Baum, having moved to Chicago, was influenced by the fair's spectacle. The White City's glittering buildings and gleaming avenues can be seen in the Emerald City's dazzling facade. The contrast between the fair's splendor and the Depression's misery reflects the duality in Oz, glittering illusion and hidden suffering. The fair also presented new foods and products, fueling consumer culture. This consumerism appears in Oz through the desire for shiny shoes, glittering bricks, and golden caps. The hidden horror is the way that spectacle distracts from injustice, luring people with promise while masking exploitation. Turning back to the 1939 film, the process of its creation reveals the chaos and ambition of the studio system. Pre-production began in 1938 under producer Mervyn LeRoy. Noel Langley, Florence Ryerson, and Edgar Allan Wolfe adapted the book into a screenplay. Langley added new elements, such as the Kansas characters mirroring those in Oz, to reinforce themes of self-discovery. Multiple directors worked on the project. Richard Thorpe began filming but was dismissed after 2 weeks because his approach lacked whimsy. George Cukor briefly took over and suggested costume and makeup changes, including dropping Garland's blonde wig and glamorous makeup in favor of a more natural appearance. Victor Fleming then assumed the role of main director. He filmed most of the movie, but he left near completion to direct Gone with the Wind. King Vidor completed the Kansas sequences, including the Over the Rainbow song. The use of multiple directors underscores the tumult behind the film's seamless narrative. Each director brought different sensibilities, yet the film appears cohesive. The hidden horror is that creative workers were easily replaced and that their contributions were often uncredited. The script evolved through numerous drafts. Early versions included sequences that were later cut, such as a jitterbug dance in the haunted forest. Another discarded scene featured Dorothy rescuing the Scarecrow from the Wicked Witch's castle by disguising herself as a Winky. The film originally opened with a musical number called The Kansas Cycle that introduced the characters and their desires. Studio executives trimmed and reshaped the film to balance pacing and tone. The result is a tight narrative that moves swiftly from Kansas to Oz and back again. The process illustrates how art is shaped by collaboration and compromise. Writers and directors worked under the watchful eyes of producers who prioritized profitability. The hidden horror is that creative visions can be molded to fit commercial demands, sometimes at the expense of deeper messages. Color technology played a crucial role in the film's impact. Technicolor, a process that used 3 strips of film to capture vibrant hues, required intense lighting and careful planning. Cameras were heavy, and film stock was expensive. Lighting on set was blindingly bright, causing actors to sweat and makeup to melt. Scenes shot in Technicolor often had to be redone because of color mismatches or technical glitches. The decision to shoot Oz in Technicolor and Kansas in sepia added to the film's mythic quality. When the door opens from the sepia farmhouse to reveal a Technicolor Munchkinland, audiences gasped. The effect symbolized a transition from dull reality to vivid fantasy. Yet this magic came at a cost. The heat from the lights contributed to Margaret Hamilton's burns. The heavy cameras slowed production. The cost of Technicolor added pressure to recoup expenses. The hidden horror is that the film's beauty was built on the discomfort and danger of those who produced it. Music was another integral element. Harold Arlen composed the melodies, and E.Y. Harburg wrote the lyrics. Over the Rainbow, with its yearning lyrics, nearly did not make it into the movie. Some executives considered it too slow or sophisticated for children. Arlen and Harburg fought to keep it, believing it captured Dorothy's longing. The song won the Academy Award for Best Original Song and became Garland's signature. Other songs, like Ding Dong the Witch is Dead and If I Only Had a Brain, added charm and humor. Harburg, a socially conscious lyricist, incorporated subversive lines. In the outtake The Jitterbug, which was cut for time, he used swing music, then associated with African American culture, to comment on the fear of modern influences. The presence and absence of songs demonstrate the negotiation between artistry and market expectations. The hidden horror is that songs that challenged norms were often the first to be cut. Beyond the set, the marketing and release of The Wizard of Oz reveal the complexities of film distribution in the 1930s. MGM partnered with Loews Theatres for a widespread release. The film premiered at the Strand Theatre in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, a test market. Critics praised its visuals and performances, but questioned whether it would appeal to adults. Box office returns were respectable, but not spectacular. The film cost more than $2 million and initially recorded a modest profit. It was only through re-releases in 1949 and television broadcasts, starting in 1956, that it became a cultural phenomenon. Television allowed families to watch the film together annually. The recurring broadcasts transformed it into a ritual. Children grew up anticipating the moment when Dorothy would open the door to Oz. The hidden horror is that a film that critiques false wizards became a tool for corporate profit and a means of selling advertising to captive audiences. The film's actors carried the burden of their roles for years. Garland, as mentioned, endured typecasting and health issues. Bolger continued to appear in variety shows and Broadway productions. La returned to the stage, starring in burlesque and other productions. Hamilton found work on television and in commercials, famously appearing as Cora in Maxwell House coffee ads. Yet the public often saw them through the lens of their Oz characters. When Hamilton visited schools, children cried and hid, believing she was the Wicked Witch. The conflation of actor and role limited her opportunities. The hidden horror is that audiences can imprison performers in their most famous roles, ignoring their range and humanity. While the film sanitized some elements of the book, it inadvertently introduced new layers of meaning. The sepia tone of Kansas evokes the Dust Bowl imagery captured by photographers like Dorothea Lange and Arthur Rothstein. Their pictures of stoic, dust-lined faces and barren fields shaped the public's understanding of rural suffering. Dorothy's small farmhouse mirrors the precariousness of families who lost farms to foreclosure. Her dream of a place where trouble melts like lemon drops mirrors migrants' hopes for California, as depicted in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. The sepia world is stark but grounded. The Technicolor Oz is vibrant but treacherous. When Dorothy returns home, she embraces the drab reality with new appreciation. The contrast reflects the tension between escapism and acceptance. The hidden horror is that many families did not have the option to return to a safe home. The interplay between Oz and other works of fiction offers further insight. Contemporary to Baum were other authors who used fantasy to critique society. Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward imagined a socialist utopia in the year 2000, where private property had been abolished. William Morris News from Nowhere offered a pastoral vision of a post-capitalist world. Charlotte Perkins' Gilman's Herland depicted a society of women raising children communally and living harmoniously. Like Oz, these works presented alternate realities to comment on existing inequities. Unlike Oz, they were explicitly political, and their messages sparked debate. Baum's choice to embed his critique in a children's story allowed it to circumvent censors and reach a broad audience. The hidden horror here is that explicit critiques are often marginalized or dismissed, while subtle ones may slip by unnoticed but risk being misread. The story's appropriation for commercial ventures continued long after Baum's death. In the 1950s and 1960s, advertisers used Oz imagery to sell products. Coffee companies urged consumers to follow the yellow brick road to quality. Insurance companies promised protection from tornadoes and witches. Toy companies produced dolls, puzzles, and board games. Each product repackaged a piece of the story, divorcing it from its social commentary. Schools staged plays with sanitized scripts that removed witches or replaced the word witch with bad person to avoid offending religious parents. In some cases, entire sections of the book were cut to shorten performances. These adaptations reflect how economic and cultural pressures shape art. The hidden horror is that the more a story is commodified, the more its critical elements are shaved away. The economic metaphors in Oz also resonate with the great financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath. As homeowners defaulted on mortgages and banks collapsed, politicians once again debated the role of regulation, stimulus, and monetary policy. Figures such as Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke and Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson took center stage. Critics accused them of being wizards behind curtains, manipulating interest rates and bailouts while ordinary people lost jobs and homes. Movements like Occupy Wall Street evoked populist rhetoric, condemning the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the 1%. Protesters pitched tents in financial districts, creating their own emerald cities to draw attention to inequality. They held assemblies, shared food, and organized teach-ins about banking and corporate governance. The media's coverage of the movement varied from sympathetic to derisive. In this climate, The Wizard of Oz served as a shorthand for exposing the myth of trickle-down economics. The hidden horror is that lessons from past financial crises were not fully learned, leading to repeated cycles of boom and bust. The advent of social media has added new layers to the Oz allegory. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram have become arenas where wizards and witches compete for attention. Influencers project curated images of their lives, akin to the wizard's projected face. Algorithms act as green spectacles, shaping what users see. Echo chambers form, reinforcing beliefs. Trolls and bots spread misinformation, stirring fear and anger. In this environment, pulling back the curtain requires media literacy and critical thinking. Fact-checking organizations, independent journalists, and educators work to teach people how to identify manipulation. The hidden horror is that the pace and scale of information flow can overwhelm individuals, making it easy for false wizards to build followings and difficult for truth to break through. Science and technology advancements also tie into Oz. The Tin Woodman can be read as an early cyborg, a human integrated with machinery. Today, artificial intelligence, robotics, and biotechnology raise questions about what it means to be human. Factory workers are being replaced by robots, drivers by autonomous vehicles. Prosthetics and implants blur the line between flesh and metal. The Tin Woodman's fear of losing his humanity speaks to concerns about the dehumanizing effects of technology. The Scarecrow's quest for knowledge mirrors debates about education in the age of information. With access to vast digital libraries, the challenge is not lack of information, but the ability to discern and synthesize. The Cowardly Lion's struggle with courage parallels the mental health crises faced by many in a world of constant change and uncertainty. Dorothy's navigation of multiple realities foreshadows virtual and augmented realities. The hidden horror is that technological progress can amplify inequality and create new forms of exploitation, if not guided by ethical considerations. Environmental crises provide another lens. Climate change has intensified storms, droughts, and wildfires, making Dorothy's cyclone a symbol of the climate disasters that displace communities today. Island nations face rising seas. Farmers endure unpredictable weather. The yellow brick road might now be a pipeline, transporting fossil fuels across indigenous lands, threatening ecosystems. Activists like Greta Thunberg, reminiscent of Dorothy's youthful determination, challenge world leaders to act. They speak of stolen futures and call for a just transition. The Wicked Witch could be interpreted as an oil company that profits from extraction while spreading misinformation. The Emerald City could be a capital city ignoring scientific warnings. The poppy field could be consumer culture lulling citizens into inaction. The hidden horror is that humanity may sleep through the alarm until it is too late to return home. In the realm of literature, parallels to Oz abound. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale presents a dystopian society where women's bodies are controlled by the state. Like Oz, Atwood's story uses a fictional world to critique real oppressive systems. In George Orwell's Animal Farm, anthropomorphized animals overthrow their human farmer only to see pigs become the new tyrants. Like the Scarecrow's ascension to leadership in the Emerald City, the pig's rise highlights how revolutions can replace one elite with another if structural injustices are not addressed. These works remind us that allegory is a powerful tool for political commentary. The hidden horror is that sometimes, after the revolution, the people in power replicate the behaviors of their predecessors. The Oz story also intersects with psychology through the concept of the inner child. Therapists often encourage adults to reconnect with their inner child to heal trauma. Dorothy embodies the inner child's qualities: curiosity, hope, and vulnerability. She believes in the goodness of strangers and the possibility of return. The witches and wizards represent internalized fears and authoritative voices. The journey through Oz can be read as an integration of fragmented parts of the self. The Scarecrow is the intellectual self, the Tin Woodman the emotional self, the Lion the instinctual self, and Dorothy the conscious self. Integrating these parts leads to wholeness. However, therapy also recognizes that societal structures shape individual psychology. Healing requires changes at both personal and collective levels. The hidden horror is that focusing solely on individual healing can neglect systemic injustices that create trauma in the first place. Turning again to the cast of the 1939 film, their lives after Oz offer cautionary tales about fame. Margaret Hamilton devoted herself to education and community work. She volunteered with the Girl Scouts and taught acting to children. She embraced her association with the Wicked Witch, using it to teach about overcoming fear. Ray Bolger and Jack Haley continued performing, but their roles were often defined by Oz. Burt Lahr's son, John Lahr, wrote a biography of his father, revealing his battles with anxiety and his dependence on the approval of audiences. Judy Garland became a gay icon, her struggles resonating with those who felt marginalized. Her daughter, Liza Minnelli, achieved her own stardom, but also faced addiction. These stories illustrate the human cost of stardom. The hidden horror is that behind every beloved performance lies a life shaped by pressures and pains unseen by audiences. As we approach the end of this exploration, it is worth imagining an alternate Oz story, one written from a 21st century perspective. In this version, Dorothy could be a climate refugee whose farm is destroyed by drought. The Scarecrow might be a graduate burdened by student loans, told he has no knowledge because his degree does not guarantee a job. The Tin Woodman might be an automated factory worker searching for meaning after his skills become obsolete. The Cowardly Lion could be a veteran dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, doubting his courage. The Wicked Witch of the West could be a tech CEO hoarding data and wealth. The Wizard might be a conglomerate of social media platforms projecting false narratives. The Good Witch of the North could be a community organizer teaching solidarity. The Yellow Brick Road could be replaced by a highway clogged with refugees and migrants. The Emerald City could be a gleaming corporate campus with private security and greenwashed policies. This modern Oz would reflect today's crises. The hidden horror would still be present, but so would the potential for awakening and collective transformation. In any case, The Wizard of Oz endures because it invites reinterpretation. Its symbols are flexible, its structure is archetypal, and its heart is rooted in human experience. By examining its political, economic, social, environmental, and psychological dimensions, we uncover layer after layer of meaning. Each layer reveals horrors hidden behind wonder. At the same time, each layer offers lessons about resistance, resilience, and hope. The challenge for readers and viewers is to carry these lessons into the real world, to question wizards, to comfort those in poppy-induced slumber, to share oil with rusted neighbours, to lift scarecrows from their posts, to fight witches who enslave, to cross deserts of indifference, and to click our heels not to return to a status quo, but to envision a home that has never been, but might someday come to be, through our collective effort. No exploration of the hidden horror of the Wizard of Oz would be complete without a deeper engagement with the global phenomenon of populism itself. Populism emerges whenever large segments of the population feel alienated from political elites and economic systems. In the late 19th century, populists in the United States organized around issues like free silver and railroad regulation. In Russia, the Narodnik movement sought to mobilize peasants against czarist autocracy. In Latin America, leaders like Juan Perón in Argentina and Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico appealed directly to workers and peasants, challenging oligarchies. In Europe, figures like Boulanger in France and later Mussolini in Italy harnessed discontent for different ends. Although these movements differed in ideology, they shared a narrative of corruption at the center and purity among the common people. Populist rhetoric often turns politics into a battle between good and evil, simplifying complex issues into moral binaries. In Oz, the Wicked Witches clearly embody evil, while Dorothy and her friends represent goodness. The wizard is revealed as fraudulent. This narrative aligns with populist frameworks that contrast honest folk with dishonest elites. The hidden horror is that populism can be co-opted by demagogues who exploit anger for personal power. Examples abound, from Huey Long's Share Our Wealth program, which promised redistribution but concentrated authority, to modern leaders who run on anti-establishment platforms only to erode democratic institutions once in office. Populism also intersects with conspiracy theories, which flourish in times of uncertainty. The late 19th century saw the rise of conspiratorial beliefs about international bankers, secret societies, and foreign immigrants. Some populists blamed their woes on Jewish financiers, feeding into anti-Semitic tropes. Others saw a Catholic conspiracy behind economic policies. These conspiracies deflected blame away from structural issues and towards scapegoats. Similarly, in Oz, the causes of Kansas's poverty are externalized onto witches and wizards rather than examined within the community. Today, conspiracy theories like QAnon claim that hidden cabals control governments, echoing the idea of a man behind the curtain. Such theories undermine trust in institutions and can lead to violence. The hidden horror is that allegories about deception can feed into paranoid worldviews if not grounded in critical analysis and solidarity. The cross of gold metaphor, central to Brian's speech and the Oz allegory, deserves close attention. Brian drew on Christian imagery to criticize economic policies that hurt farmers and workers. By comparing the gold standard to a crown of thorns and a cross, he invoked the suffering of Christ to frame the suffering of ordinary people. This rhetorical strategy tapped into the religious sensibilities of his audience. It highlighted how economic policies are not neutral, but moral choices. In Oz, the yellow brick road and the golden cap become instruments of suffering rather than salvation. Brian's speech, delivered in 1896, remains a powerful example of moral economic rhetoric. However, the invocation of religious symbolism can also divide. Opponents accused Brian of sacrilege. They argued that mixing religion and politics was inappropriate. The debate illustrates the power and peril of using sacred imagery in public discourse. The hidden horror is that when politics becomes a proxy for religious battle, compromise and rational discussion become difficult. If we return to the figure of Dorothy, we see a character who is perpetually in motion. She is swept up by a cyclone, travels along a road, and ultimately journeys back. Her movement mirrors that of migrants and refugees who cross borders seeking safety and opportunity. In the 21st century, millions are displaced by conflict, climate change, and economic instability. They traverse deserts, seas, and mountain ranges, often facing hostility at borders. Governments erect walls, deploy border patrols, and detain migrants in camps. The language used to describe migrants' caravans, swarms, invaders, dehumanizes them, making it easier to justify exclusion. In Oz, travelers encounter barriers and guardians who demand proof of worthiness. Dorothy must prove herself by defeating a witch before being allowed to see the wizard. The hidden horror is that societies demand heroism from those seeking refuge when they should offer compassion and support. At the level of personal psychology, Dorothy's journey reveals how individuals cope with trauma. Psychologists understand trauma as a response to overwhelming events that threaten one's sense of safety. Dorothy experiences the loss of her home, separation from her family, and encounters with danger. She displays resilience by forming friendships and focusing on her goal. Trauma therapists note that storytelling can help process trauma. By narrating events, individuals integrate them into their identity. The Oz story, with its structured journey and resolution, offers a framework for understanding chaos and loss. However, not all trauma narratives end with a safe return. Many people live with unresolved trauma. The hidden horror is that for some, there is no final clicking of heels. Recovery is ongoing and complicated by systemic injustices. Regarding the role of indigenous peoples in the Oz allegory, more can be said. The winged monkeys, enslaved under the golden cap, were punished for mocking a princess by throwing her into a river. As a result, they are cursed to obey whoever wears the cap. Some scholars see this as reflecting the history of Native Americans, who were punished for resisting colonization and forced into treaties and reservations. Baum himself wrote editorials advocating the extermination of indigenous peoples after the Battle of Wounded Knee. These writings are shocking in their brutality. They reveal that Baum, despite his imaginative storytelling, absorbed and propagated the genocidal ideologies of his time. When reading Oz, one must confront the dissonance between the author's creativity and his racism. The hidden horror is that beloved cultural artifacts can be rooted in the oppression of others. This recognition does not necessarily mean discarding such works, but it does require critically engaging with them and acknowledging the harm their creators supported. Expanding on the film's behind-the-scenes issues, consider the case of Victor Fleming, credited as the director. He was known for his energetic personality and willingness to push actors. On the set of Gone with the Wind, he famously slapped actress Vivien Leigh to get a performance he wanted. On the Wizard of Oz set, his demands contributed to the stress experienced by actors. His departure to work on another project in the middle of production illustrates the way studios shuffled talent as commodities. Fleming won the Academy Award for Best Director for Gone with the Wind, not for Oz. The recognition he received for one film overshadows the collaborative nature of filmmaking. Similarly, composer Herbert Stothart won the Oscar for Best Original Score for Oz, yet much of the music's emotional impact came from Arlen and Harburg's songs. The hidden horror is that awards and accolades often obscure the contributions of many collaborators, perpetuating myths of singular genius. Another aspect of the film's legacy is the urban legend involving a hanging munchkin. For years, viewers claimed to see a figure hanging from a tree in the background of the forest scene. This was later debunked as a large bird, perhaps a crane, stretching its wings. The persistence of this legend speaks to the audience's fascination with hidden tragedies. People project horrors onto the film, perhaps because they sense the real suffering behind the scenes. The hidden horror is that we sometimes invent tragedies to explain the unease we feel when confronted with sanitized narratives. It reflects a yearning to peel back layers and find the truth, even when the truth is simply the exploitation and abuse that we already know occurred on set. Another figure worth revisiting is Toto. In the book, Toto rarely speaks. In the film, he is a loyal companion who follows Dorothy everywhere. Some interpretations see Toto as representing the teetotalers, the temperance movement that sought to ban alcohol. Temperance activists argued that alcohol consumption destroyed families and morals. Women in particular suffered from domestic violence fueled by drunkenness. The temperance movement overlapped with suffrage and populism. The Munchkins celebrating the witch's death with singing and dancing may evoke the festive atmosphere of the temperance movement's successes. However, the temperance movement also had a dark side. Prohibition, enacted in 1920 through the 18th Amendment, led to an underground economy of speakeasies and organized crime. It criminalized working class and immigrant cultures that centered around alcohol, while leaving the drinking habits of elites relatively untouched. Eventually, prohibition was repealed in 1933. The hidden horror is that moral crusades can produce unintended consequences and disproportionately impact marginalized communities. Turning our attention to the currency debates of the 19th century, one must consider the international context. The gold standard was a global system that tied currencies to a fixed amount of gold. Britain adopted it in 1821, Germany in 1871. The United States oscillated between bimetallism and gold. Silver discoveries in the American West, such as the Comstock lode, made silver abundant, but the Coinage Act of 1873 eliminated it from coinage. Free silver advocates argued that bimetallism would bring the United States in line with countries like France, which used both metals. Opponents feared that adopting free silver unilaterally would devalue the currency and harm international trade. The debates illustrate how domestic policy is influenced by global economic trends. In Oz, the travelers cross different regions, each with its own rules and customs. Their journey reflects the complexities of navigating international economic systems. The hidden horror is that decisions made by distant bankers and politicians can devastate communities thousands of miles away. Let us also examine the role of natural disasters in shaping populist sentiment. In addition to economic factors, environmental catastrophes intensified hardship. Droughts in the 1880s and 1890s dried up crops across the plains. Swarms of locusts devoured fields. Blizzards and floods destroyed homes. These disasters were not isolated. They compounded financial losses. Farmers lacked insurance or government aid. Banks foreclosed, leaving families homeless. The cyclone in Oz thus embodies not only social upheaval, but also the literal storms that battered the Midwest. Climate variability remains a challenge today. Hurricanes flatten Caribbean islands, typhoons flood Southeast Asia, and wildfires ravage the American West. Each disaster exposes inequalities. Wealthier communities rebuild, poorer ones languish. The hidden horror is that climate change will exacerbate these disparities, making the search for safety and home ever more urgent. Turning to the relationship between humans and animals, we see in Oz an acknowledgement of interspecies cooperation. Animals like Toto, the cowardly lion, and the stork help Dorothy. They speak and exhibit emotions. This suggests a respect for non-human life often absent in literature of the time. Yet the winged monkeys and the Winkies are enslaved. In the real world, animals have been exploited for labor, food, entertainment, and research. Circuses, like those that employed small performers who later appeared as munchkins, used elephants and lions in ways that caused harm. In modern times, debates over animal rights and welfare have led to changes. Many circuses have retired animals. Films like Dumbo and documentaries like Blackfish have spurred public outcry. The hidden horror is that empathy can be selective, extending to some animals while ignoring the suffering of others, including human beings. Exploring the contributions of songwriters Harold Arlen and Yip Harburg offers insight into how artists embed social justice into popular music. Harburg, born to Russian Jewish immigrants, grew up in poverty in New York. He owned an appliance store that went bankrupt during the Depression. Experiencing economic hardship firsthand influenced his writing. He believed that those who are hungry are seldom unreasonable. He wrote lyrics for the social satire song, "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?", which became an anthem of the Depression. His lyrics often critiqued inequality and championed the downtrodden. Arlen, the son of a cantor, infused his melodies with blues and jazz influences. Together, they created songs for Oz that spoke to longing, hope, and self-discovery. While the film's commercial success enriched MGM, Arlen and Harburg used their art to comment on society. The hidden horror is that socially conscious artists must operate within industries that prioritize profit over message, risking the dilution of their work. Finally, we reflect on the personal resonance of Oz for different readers and viewers. For some, it is a story of childhood nostalgia, evoking memories of family and wonder. For others, it is a tale of exile and return, mirroring experiences of migration. For activists, it is a cautionary tale about false leaders. For scholars, it is a rich text for analysis. The multiplicity of interpretations attests to the story's depth. Yet this richness comes with responsibility. We must resist the temptation to impose one definitive meaning. Instead, we can hold multiple truths and recognize that a single narrative can illuminate many aspects of human experience. The hidden horror lies in the attempt to flatten a complex story into a single moral or political lesson, thereby stripping it of its power to speak across contexts. Embracing the plurality of Oz allows it to remain a living allegory, adaptable and relevant as long as injustice and hope coexist in the world. In sum, this final reflection adds to the tapestry of themes woven throughout the examination of the hidden horror of the Wizard of Oz. It underscores the global, psychological, environmental, and moral dimensions of populism and allegory. It revisits key figures and events, highlighting the complexities of interpretation. It invites readers to see the story not as a relic, but as a mirror reflecting timeless struggles. Just as Dorothy's companions found that they possessed the qualities they sought, we too have the capacity to challenge false wizards, dismantle oppressive structures, and create a world where the road to justice is not paved with glittering deception, but with solidarity, empathy, and courage. As we draw this journey to a close, there is value in pausing to reflect on the personal lessons that the hidden horror of the Wizard of Oz imparts. Stories endure because they speak to our deepest fears and aspirations. In Oz, we see characters who are frightened and yet brave, who are damaged and yet kind, who are lost and yet resourceful. Their story reminds us that courage does not mean the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. It teaches that wisdom is not the preserve of elites, but can be found in those who till the soil and forge iron. It shows that love and empathy are not weaknesses, but strengths that enable communities to survive hardship. It reveals that power wielded without accountability leads to suffering, and that deception can be masked with charm and spectacle. It encourages us to look behind curtains, question smooth rhetoric, and demand transparency. Furthermore, the narrative demonstrates that journeys are rarely linear. Progress often loops back on itself. Victories are partial, and setbacks are part of the process. Dorothy returns to Kansas, but she is changed. The Scarecrow, Tin Woodman, and Lion assume new roles, but their work continues. Real-world movements for justice follow similar patterns. The populists won some reforms and lost others. The civil rights movement of the 1960s achieved landmark legislation, but did not eradicate racism. The fight for workers' rights yielded labor laws, but did not eliminate exploitation. Each generation must take up the cause anew, informed by history. In this, the hidden horror of the Wizard of Oz is not a tale of despair, but a call to persistence. It invites us to honor those who came before, learn from their mistakes, and continue their struggles. Lastly, the story underscores the power of imagination. Baum conjured a world that has captivated readers for more than a century. Imagination allows us to envision alternatives to the present. Allegory uses the unreal to reveal the real. By reimagining Oz for each era, we exercise our capacity to dream of justice, equity, and community. In this sense, the hidden horror is not the darkness itself, but the possibility that we might stop imagining better worlds. As long as we keep telling stories, asking questions, and refusing to accept glittering deceptions, we keep the door open to transformation. The yellow brick road stretches on, not as a trap, but as an invitation to walk together toward a future built on courage, compassion, and collective wisdom.